What if the people in charge aren't fully human? Ancient texts describe a hybrid race, born from beings called the Anunnaki, that ruled over our ancestors for thousands of years. And new evidence suggests their bloodlines, with enhanced intelligence, lifespans, and a hunger for power, never went extinct. They just evolved. They just blended in. In the dusty archives of ancient Mesopotamia, carved into tablets older than recorded history itself, lies a story that challenges everything we think we know about human origins. They called themselves the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens, wielding technologies that seemed like magic to primitive humans. But here's what makes your blood run cold. According to these texts, they didn't just visit Earth. They stayed, they bred, and their hybrid offspring, known as the Nephilim, walked among us for thousands of years. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial theories in ancient history, not just to explore what these tablets say, but to examine the bloodlines that may have survived to this very day. Because if even a fraction of this is true, it means some of the most powerful families on Earth carry DNA that isn't entirely human. Welcome to a journey that will make you question everything you thought you knew about our species. This isn't just ancient mythology. This is a genetic mystery that reaches into the highest levels of power, influence, and control in our modern world. So, settle in, because what you're about to discover will leave you staring at the night sky with entirely different eyes. The story begins over 6,000 years ago in ancient Sumer, in what is now modern-day Iraq. Here, in humanity's first known civilization, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, recording events that would echo through every major religion and mystery tradition for millennia to come. These weren't fairy tales or primitive myths. These were detailed historical accounts, complete with dates, genealogies, and technological descriptions that seem impossibly advanced for their time. The Sumerian tablets speak of the Anunnaki, literally meaning those who from heaven to earth came as a race of beings who arrived on our planet with a specific mission. According to these texts, they came seeking gold, not for decoration or currency, but for something far more crucial to their survival. The tablets describe how they established mining operations, created the first cities, and most remarkably, how they genetically modified primitive humans to serve as a workforce. But here's where the story takes a turn that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge. The tablets don't describe the Anunnaki as gods in the mystical sense. They describe them as flesh and blood beings with advanced technology, internal politics, and very human-like desires. They had hierarchies, rivalries, and most importantly, for our story tonight, they had the ability to reproduce with humans. The chief among them was Enlil, described as the Lord of the Atmosphere and Earth. His half-brother, Enki, known as the Lord of the Waters and Wisdom, was said to be humanity's protector and the one who warned Noah of the coming flood. But it was their offspring and the offspring of other Anunnaki who would create the bloodlines that may persist to this day. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like ancient science fiction. But consider this. Every major culture on Earth has flood myths. Every ancient civilization speaks of beings who came from the sky and taught humans agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and metallurgy. The parallels are too numerous and too specific to dismiss as coincidence. The Hebrew Bible, the Book of Enoch, Mesopotamian texts, Hindu scriptures, Greek mythology, they all tell variations of the same story. Beings from the heavens who mated with human women, producing giants, heroes, and kings who ruled over ordinary humans. The question isn't whether these stories exist, it's whether they're describing actual historical events. According to the ancient texts, the union between the Anunnaki and human women produced a hybrid race known as the Nephilim. The Hebrew word literally means the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. These weren't just larger humans. They were described as possessing abilities that set them apart from ordinary people. Enhanced intelligence, longer lifespans, psychic abilities, and physical characteristics that mark them as different. The Book of Genesis mentions them briefly. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. But it's the Book of Enoch excluded from the biblical canon that provides the detailed account of what really happened. According to Enoch, 200 of these watchers descended to earth and took human wives. Their leader, Semjaza, convinced the others to participate in this forbidden union. The children born from these relationships were giants described as being 300 cubits tall, roughly 450 ft. But more than their size, these Nephilim possessed knowledge and abilities that allowed them to dominate human civilization. They taught humans warfare, the making of weapons, cosmetics, jewelry, and according to some texts, forbidden knowledge about the movements of the stars and the secrets of heaven itself. They became the kings, the heroes, the demigods of ancient mythology, and when they died, their spirits were said to become the demons that would plague humanity forever after. But here's the crucial detail that most people miss. The texts clearly state that the Nephilim survived the flood. Genesis mentions them existing both before and after the deluge. This means that either some escaped the destruction or the genetic mixing between human and non-human DNA continued even after the floodwaters receded. This is where the bloodline theory begins to take shape. If the Nephilim survived, and if they possessed abilities and knowledge that made them natural rulers, wouldn't they have sought to maintain their genetic advantage? Wouldn't they have established dynasties, preserved their bloodlines, and passed down their secrets through carefully controlled breeding programs? The ancient world is filled with royal families who claimed divine ancestry. The pharaohs of Egypt insisted they were descended from the gods. The kings of Mesopotamia traced their lineage back to the Anunnaki themselves. Greek heroes were said to be half divine. Norse kings claimed descent from the Aesir. These weren't just political claims, they were statements about genetic heritage. Consider the strange consistency of certain physical traits among ancient royalty. Elongated skulls, unusual height, specific facial features that appeared generation after generation in ruling families. Modern DNA analysis has revealed that European royalty, despite coming from different regions and time periods, share remarkably similar genetic markers. They're literally more closely related to each other than to the populations they ruled. But it's not just ancient history. The theory suggests that these bloodlines have been carefully preserved and maintained throughout human civilization, that the same families who ruled in ancient Babylon, Egypt, and Rome evolved into the banking dynasties, political families, and industrial titans who shape our world today. Think about it from a strategic perspective. If you possessed knowledge and abilities that gave you an advantage over ordinary humans, wouldn't you want to preserve those advantages? Wouldn't you create systems, financial, political, religious, that ensured your bloodline remained in positions of power? And wouldn't you be very, very careful about who you allowed into your genetic lineage? This isn't about conspiracy theories or anti-establishment rhetoric. This is about examining the possibility that human civilization has been shaped by a genetic elite whose origins trace back to something far older and stranger than we've been taught to believe. The evidence isn't just in ancient texts. It's in the archaeological record, in genetic studies, in the consistent patterns of power that have persisted across cultures and millennia. It's in the technologies that appeared suddenly in human civilization without any apparent developmental period. It's in the mathematical precision of ancient monuments that we still can't fully explain today, but most compellingly, it's in the bloodlines themselves. When you trace the genealogies of the world's most powerful families, you find connections that span continents and centuries. You find carefully preserved genetic lines that have maintained their dominance through every major historical transition. You find evidence of breeding programs designed to preserve specific traits and abilities. The ancient Sumerian king lists described rulers who reigned for thousands of years. Mainstream historians dismiss these as mythological exaggerations. But what if they're describing beings with dramatically extended lifespans? What if the genetic modifications that created the Nephilim included longevity that far exceeded normal human limits? And what if some of those genetic advantages persist today, hidden within bloodlines that have spent millennia learning to blend in, to appear human while maintaining their essential differences? What if the reason certain families have maintained power for so long isn't just wealth or luck, but genuine genetic advantages that most humans simply don't possess? The implications are staggering. It would mean that human history isn't the story of gradual progress and social evolution that we've been taught. It would mean we've been living in a world shaped by genetic castes, where true power has always belonged to those who carry the bloodline of beings who were never entirely human to begin with. But before we dive deeper into the modern evidence, we need to understand exactly what the ancient texts tell us about these bloodlines. Because the more you study the original sources, the more you realize that what we call mythology might actually be the most accurate historical record we have of humanity's true origins. The question isn't whether these stories are true in every literal detail. The question is what they reveal about the genetic legacy that may still be walking among us today. And that's where our investigation takes a turn that will challenge everything you think you know about power, politics, and the hidden forces that have shaped human civilization for thousands of years. Because if the Anunnaki bloodlines survived, if they've been carefully preserved through millennia of human history, then understanding them isn't just about ancient mysteries. It's about understanding the world we live in right now. It's about recognizing that the game of power and control may have been rigged from the very beginning by players who were never entirely human in the first place. And the evidence for this isn't hidden in dusty archives or ancient tablets. It's all around us, encoded in the DNA of the world's elite, visible in the patterns of power that have persisted across every civilization and active in the bloodlines that continue to shape our world today. The deeper you dig into the genealogical records of history's ruling classes, the more disturbing the patterns become. It's not just that these families maintained power, it's how they maintained it. Through marriage alliances that weren't about love or politics, but about preserving something in their blood that ordinary humans don't possess. Take the European royal houses, for instance. For over 1,000 years, they've practiced what historians politely call strategic intermarriage. But look closer at the patterns. These aren't random political alliances. They're systematic breeding programs designed to concentrate specific genetic traits within a closed population. The Habsburgs, the Plantagenets, the Romanovs, they all share genetic markers that trace back through carefully documented bloodlines to sources that mainstream genealogy can't quite explain. And it's not just European royalty. The same patterns appear in every major civilization. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs married their siblings to preserve divine blood. Chinese emperors claimed the mandate of heaven through genetic inheritance. Aztec rulers traced their lineage to gods who came from the stars. Japanese emperors maintained their divine bloodline for over 2,000 years through careful genetic preservation. But here's what makes your skin crawl. When you map these bloodlines using modern genetic analysis, you don't find the diversity you'd expect from normal human populations. Instead, you find genetic bottlenecks, points where the genetic pool was deliberately narrowed to preserve specific traits. Traits that gave these families advantages that kept them in power generation after generation. What kind of advantages? The ancient texts are surprisingly specific. Enhanced cognitive abilities that allowed them to process complex information faster than normal humans. Longer lifespans that gave them time to accumulate knowledge and wealth across centuries. Psychic abilities that let them manipulate and control others through means that seemed supernatural, and physical characteristics that marked them as different. Taller stature, distinctive facial features, and eye colors that appeared in their bloodlines, but rarely in general populations. Sound familiar? Because if you study the world's most powerful families today, you'll find these same traits appearing again and again. Exceptional intelligence that allows them to dominate complex financial and political systems. Lifespans that consistently exceed statistical averages, an uncanny ability to influence others and predict social trends, and physical characteristics that mark them as belonging to a genetic elite. But it's not just about individual traits. It's about what happens when these bloodlines reproduce. The ancient texts describe how Nephilim offspring inherited abilities from both parents, creating genetic combinations that were more than the sum of their parts. Modern genetics calls this hybrid vigor, the tendency for crossbred organisms to exhibit superior qualities compared to either parent line. Now imagine this process continuing for thousands of years. Imagine bloodlines that have been selectively breeding not just for political advantage, but for genetic optimization. Imagine families that possess institutional knowledge passed down through generations, combined with genetic advantages that make them naturally superior at acquiring and maintaining power. This isn't speculation. The evidence is hiding in plain sight, encoded in family trees that stretch back centuries. Visible in genetic studies that reveal unusual markers in elite populations, and active in breeding programs that continue to this day under the guise of high society marriages and strategic alliances. Consider the banking dynasties that have controlled global finance for centuries. The Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Medici, families whose influence spans continents and whose genetic lines have been carefully preserved through strategic marriages. They don't just inherit wealth, they inherit cognitive abilities that allow them to manipulate complex financial systems in ways that seem almost supernatural to ordinary humans. Or look at the political dynasties that have shaped modern history. The Bushes, the Kennedys, the Churchills, families whose members consistently rise to positions of extreme power despite statistical odds that should make this impossible. They don't just inherit political connections. They inherit charisma, intelligence, and strategic thinking abilities that mark them as genetically different from the populations they govern. But it's the tech billionaires and modern oligarchs that provide the most compelling evidence. These aren't self-made entrepreneurs who rose from nothing through hard work and luck. When you trace their genealogies, you find connections to old money families, to European nobility, to bloodlines that have maintained wealth and power for centuries. They're not disrupting the established order. They're the latest generation of genetic elites adapting to new forms of control. The patterns are too consistent to be coincidental. These families consistently produce individuals with exceptional abilities in whatever field dominates their era. When agriculture was the basis of power, they excelled at land management and population control. When industry became dominant, they led the Industrial Revolution. When finance became the key to global control, they created the banking systems that still govern world economics. And now, as information and technology become the ultimate forms of power, they're leading the digital revolution. This isn't about conspiracy theories or secret societies. This is about recognizing that human civilization may have been shaped by genetic advantages that most of us simply don't possess. Advantages that trace back to those original hybridization events described in ancient texts. Advantages that have been carefully preserved and concentrated through millennia of selective breeding. And here's the truly unsettling part. If these bloodlines carry genetic modifications that originated with non-human entities, then what we're looking at isn't just social inequality, it's biological hierarchy. It's a caste system based not on arbitrary social constructs, but on fundamental genetic differences that give some humans capabilities that others can never achieve. The ancient texts warned about this. They described how the Nephilim would establish kingdoms and rule over ordinary humans not through force alone, but through inherent superiority. They predicted that these bloodlines would create systems of control so sophisticated that most humans wouldn't even recognize they were being dominated by a genetically distinct elite. Look around at our modern world. Look at the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few thousand families. Look at how consistently these families intermarry, preserving their genetic advantages while maintaining their grip on global resources. Look at how they shape political systems, economic structures, and even social movements to serve their interests while convincing ordinary humans that they live in free societies. This isn't about politics or economics. This is about biology. This is about the possibility that we're living in a world where true power belongs to bloodlines that were never entirely human to begin with, and those bloodlines haven't disappeared into history. They've evolved, adapted, and positioned themselves at the apex of every system that controls human civilization. But understanding their origins is just the beginning, because if these bloodlines really do carry genetic modifications that trace back to the Anunnaki, then we need to examine what that means for the rest of us. We need to look at how they've used their advantages to shape not just political and economic systems, but human consciousness itself. We need to understand that the game has been rigged from the beginning by players who possess abilities that most humans can't even comprehend. And we need to recognize that what we call human history might actually be the story of how a hybrid species has systematically dominated and controlled its purely human cousins for thousands of years. The evidence is all around us. In the genetic studies that reveal unusual markers in elite populations, in the genealogical records that trace powerful families back to sources that mainstream history can't explain, in the consistent patterns of dominance that have persisted across every civilization and every era of human development. But most importantly, the evidence is in the bloodlines themselves, still active, still breeding, still maintaining their genetic advantages, while the rest of humanity remains unaware that they're being governed by beings who may not be entirely human at all. And that's where our investigation takes its most disturbing turn. Because if these bloodlines have survived, if they've maintained their power through genetic advantage, then we need to ask the ultimate question: what do they want? What is their endgame? And how far are they willing to go to preserve their dominance over a species that they may not even consider to be their own? The answer to those questions lies not in ancient tablets or genealogical charts, but in the systematic patterns of control that have emerged over the past several centuries. Because if you're a hybrid bloodline with genetic advantages over ordinary humans, your primary concern isn't just maintaining power. It's preventing the rest of humanity from discovering what you really are. Think about it strategically. If your bloodline possesses enhanced cognitive abilities, extended lifespans, and genetic traits that mark you as fundamentally different, your survival depends on three things: staying hidden, controlling the narrative, and managing the human population in ways that serve your long-term interests. And when you examine the major systems that govern human civilization, you'll find evidence of exactly this kind of strategic manipulation. Let's start with education. For thousands of years, these bloodlines have controlled not just what humans learn, but how they think about their own origins and potential. Ancient mystery schools were exclusive institutions where genetic elites passed down knowledge while keeping ordinary humans in spiritual and intellectual darkness. Modern education systems continue this pattern, teaching sanitized versions of history that eliminate any reference to non-human influences on human development. Why do you think ancient astronaut theories are ridiculed in academic circles? Why are researchers who investigate genetic anomalies in elite populations marginalized or discredited? Why do mainstream historians dismiss thousands of ancient texts that describe the same basic story of beings from the sky who bred with humans? It's not because the evidence isn't there. It's because acknowledging that evidence would expose the genetic basis of power structures that have controlled civilization for millennia. Then there's religion. Every major faith tradition contains fragments of the original story. Beings from heaven who mated with human women, producing hybrid offspring who became the rulers and heroes of the ancient world. But these stories have been carefully edited, mythologized, and reinterpreted to hide their literal meaning. The Nephilim become angels or demons. The Anunnaki become gods. The genetic reality becomes spiritual metaphor. This wasn't accidental. Religious institutions have been controlled by the same bloodlines for thousands of years. They've used spiritual authority to manage human consciousness, redirecting natural curiosity about our origins into systems of belief that keep people focused on the afterlife, rather than the genetic reality of this one. They've turned humanity's search for truth into worship of the very beings who have been controlling them all along. But it's the modern systems of control that reveal the true scope of what we're dealing with. Because as human population has grown and technology has advanced, These bloodlines have had to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of management, methods that go far beyond traditional forms of political or economic control. Consider the media landscape. 6 corporations control 90% of what Americans read, watch, and hear. When you trace the ownership of these corporations, you find the same patterns. Boards of directors dominated by individuals from bloodlines that trace back centuries. Genetic connections between media moguls that span continents and editorial policies that consistently suppress investigation into exactly the topics we're discussing tonight. This isn't about liberal or conservative bias. This isn't about political agendas or corporate profit margins. This is about information control designed to prevent ordinary humans from recognizing that they're being governed by a genetically distinct elite. Every time someone gets close to exposing the bloodline connections, the story gets buried, the researcher gets discredited, or the investigation simply disappears from public attention. The same patterns appear in scientific research. Studies that reveal genetic anomalies in elite populations get their funding cut. Researchers who investigate ancient DNA samples that don't fit accepted models of human evolution find their careers destroyed. Archaeological discoveries that support ancient astronaut theories get locked away in private collections or museum basements where the public will never see them. But it's not just about suppressing information, it's about actively shaping human consciousness to make the truth seem impossible to believe. They've created a culture where anyone who questions official narratives gets labeled as a conspiracy theorist. They've weaponized skepticism, turning humanity's natural critical thinking abilities against anyone who gets too close to uncomfortable truths. And then there's population management. If you're a genetic elite ruling over billions of ordinary humans, your biggest concern is numbers. Too many humans, and they might eventually overwhelm your advantages through sheer statistical probability. Too few, and you lose the workforce that maintains your civilization. You need to maintain the population at levels that serve your interests while preventing ordinary humans from developing the organizational capacity to challenge your dominance. Look at the patterns of war, famine, and disease that have shaped human history. Look at how consistently these catastrophes have eliminated excess population while leaving the ruling bloodlines intact. Look at modern depopulation agendas disguised as environmental policies, health initiatives, and social programs. These aren't random events or humanitarian concerns. They're systematic management of human breeding stock by entities who view ordinary humans as a resource to be controlled. The genetic evidence supports this theory in ways that should terrify anyone who understands the implications. Modern DNA analysis has revealed that human genetic diversity is remarkably low compared to other species. We went through what geneticists call a population bottleneck, a period when human numbers were reduced to perhaps as few as 10,000 breeding individuals. Mainstream science attributes this to natural disasters or climate change. But what if it was something else entirely? What if it was the result of systematic culling by hybrid bloodlines who needed to prevent ordinary humans from developing genetic advantages that might threaten their dominance? What if the bottleneck wasn't natural selection, but artificial selection designed to preserve a genetic hierarchy where enhanced beings maintained permanent superiority over their purely human subjects? The timeline fits perfectly with the ancient accounts. The genetic bottleneck occurred roughly 12,000 years ago, exactly when the tablets described the Great Flood and the reorganization of human civilization under Anunnaki rule. The survivors weren't random. They were selected based on genetic compatibility with the hybrid bloodlines that would rebuild civilization according to their specifications. And here's where the story becomes truly sinister. Because if these bloodlines have been managing human genetics for thousands of years, if they've been systematically preventing ordinary humans from developing their full potential, then what we consider normal human capability might actually be the result of genetic suppression. Think about the occasional appearance of individuals with extraordinary abilities, child prodigies who master complex subjects without training, People with photographic memories who can process information at superhuman speeds. Individuals who demonstrate psychic abilities that mainstream science can't explain. What if these aren't anomalies or genetic mutations? What if they're glimpses of what ordinary humans could become if their genetics hadn't been systematically suppressed by hybrid bloodlines who need to maintain their advantages? The ancient texts describe how the Watchers taught forbidden knowledge to humans, astronomy, metallurgy, mathematics, and other skills that advanced civilization. But they also describe how this knowledge was later restricted, hidden away in mystery schools and secret societies controlled by the hybrid offspring of those original unions. What if human intellectual and spiritual development has been deliberately stunted to prevent ordinary humans from reclaiming abilities that were once natural to our species? This isn't just about individual capabilities. This is about species-level potential that has been systematically suppressed for thousands of years. It's about recognizing that what we call human nature, our supposed tendency toward conflict, our apparent need for hierarchical control, our alleged inability to manage complex civilizations without elite guidance, might actually be the result of genetic and psychological conditioning by bloodlines that need ordinary humans to remain dependent and controllable. But the most disturbing aspect of this theory isn't what these bloodlines have done in the past. It's what they're doing right now. Because if you possess genetic advantages over ordinary humans, if you've spent millennia perfecting systems of control, and if you're facing technological changes that could potentially level the playing field, what would your response be? You'd accelerate your control mechanisms. You'd use advanced technology to monitor and manipulate human behavior on unprecedented scales. You'd create global systems that appear to serve human interests while actually serving your own. And you'd prepare for the possibility that ordinary humans might eventually discover what you really are and attempt to challenge your dominance. Look around at our modern world through this lens. The surveillance systems that monitor every aspect of human behavior. The social media platforms that shape how people think and communicate. The economic structures that concentrate wealth in the hands of a few thousand families. The political systems that offer the illusion of choice while ensuring that real power remains in the same bloodlines generation after generation. These aren't the random products of technological development or social evolution. They're the tools of genetic elites who are preparing for a future where their advantages might be challenged by ordinary humans who finally understand what they're up against. And that future might be arriving sooner than anyone expects. Because despite their best efforts to control information and suppress human potential, cracks are beginning to appear in their system. Independent researchers are making connections that mainstream institutions can't suppress. Genetic studies are revealing anomalies that don't fit accepted models of human evolution. Archaeological discoveries are surfacing that support exactly the theories we've been discussing tonight. Most importantly, ordinary humans are beginning to ask the right questions. Questions about why the same families maintain power across centuries. Questions about genetic differences between elite populations and everyone else. Questions about the true origins of human civilization and the role of non-human influences in shaping our development. The bloodlines know this. They can see the awakening happening in real time, and their response reveals everything you need to know about what we're really dealing with. They're not trying to educate or enlighten humanity. They're accelerating their control mechanisms, implementing global systems of surveillance and manipulation that would make ancient tyrannies look primitive by comparison, because they know that if ordinary humans ever fully understand their true origins, their suppressed potential, and the genetic basis of the power structures that have controlled them for millennia, the entire system of bloodline dominance could collapse within a single generation. The question is, are we ready for that truth? Are we prepared to accept that human civilization has been shaped by genetic castes that trace their origins to non-human entities? Are we willing to confront the possibility that what we call progress has actually been systematic suppression of human potential by hybrid bloodlines who view ordinary humans as a species to be managed rather than a people to be served? The ancient texts warned us about this moment. They described a time when the secrets of the Watchers would be revealed, when humanity would rediscover its true origins and potential. They called it the time of awakening, when the genetic modifications that created the ruling bloodlines would finally be exposed and ordinary humans would reclaim their birthright. That time might be now, but understanding the truth is only the beginning. Because if these bloodlines really do carry the genetic legacy of beings who were never entirely human, then confronting them isn't just about political or social change, it's about species survival. It's about determining whether the future belongs to hybrid elites who view themselves as humanity's genetic superiors, or to the billions of ordinary humans who are finally ready to reclaim their world from bloodlines that should never have been allowed to rule in the first place. The evidence isn't just in dusty genealogical records or ancient tablets carved in forgotten languages. It's encoded in the very structure of modern society, hidden in plain sight within institutions that most people never think to question. Because when you possess genetic advantages that span millennia, you don't just maintain power through force or wealth. You reshape reality itself to ensure that ordinary humans never even recognize they're being controlled. Consider the educational institutions that have shaped human consciousness for centuries. Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge. These aren't just universities. They're breeding grounds where bloodline families have sent their offspring for generations. Not just to learn, but to network, intermarry, and preserve their genetic advantages within carefully controlled social circles. The secret societies within these institutions, Skull and Bones, the Bullingdon Club, various Masonic lodges, aren't fraternal organizations. They're genetic preservation societies designed to identify and integrate individuals who carry the bloodline markers while excluding those who don't. When you examine the membership rolls of these societies, the patterns become impossible to ignore. The same surnames appear generation after generation, connected by bloodlines that trace back through European nobility to sources that mainstream genealogy simply can't explain. These aren't coincidences or the natural result of social privilege. They're systematic breeding programs disguised as academic traditions, but it goes deeper than education. The financial systems that control global economics weren't designed by ordinary humans struggling to create fair markets. They were crafted by bloodlines with cognitive abilities that allow them to manipulate complex systems in ways that seem almost supernatural to normal human intelligence. The derivatives markets, the currency manipulation schemes, the boom and bust cycles that transfer wealth from ordinary people to elite families. These aren't accidents or the inevitable result of capitalist economics. They're sophisticated harvesting mechanisms designed by genetic elites who understand human psychology and economic behavior at levels that normal humans simply cannot comprehend. Think about it from their perspective. If you possessed enhanced cognitive abilities inherited from non-human entities, if you could process information faster and see patterns that escape ordinary human perception, wouldn't you use those advantages to create systems that automatically channel resources toward your bloodline? Wouldn't you design economic structures that appear fair on the surface while actually functioning as wealth extraction mechanisms that benefit only those with the genetic capacity to understand and manipulate them? The banking dynasties that have controlled global finance for centuries didn't achieve their dominance through luck or hard work. They inherited cognitive architectures that allow them to think in ways that ordinary humans cannot match. When a Rothschild or a Warburg makes financial decisions that seem impossibly prescient to outside observers, they're not displaying supernatural intuition. They're using genetic advantages that allow them to process economic data and predict human behavior with accuracy that appears magical to those who lack their bloodline heritage. And these advantages compound over generations. Each bloodline family doesn't just inherit wealth. They inherit institutional knowledge, strategic thinking patterns, and cognitive abilities that have been refined through centuries of selective breeding. They don't just learn how to manipulate markets. They inherit the neural architecture that makes such manipulation instinctive, natural, effortless. But financial control is just one layer of their dominance. The real power lies in their ability to shape human consciousness itself, to determine not just what people think, but how they think. And nowhere is this more evident than in the media systems that have emerged over the past century. When you trace the ownership structures of major media corporations, you find the same bloodline patterns that appear in banking, politics, and academia. The families that control information flow aren't just wealthy entrepreneurs who built media empires. They're genetic elites who understand the necessity of managing human consciousness to maintain their dominance. They don't just own newspapers and television networks. They own the lens through which ordinary humans perceive reality. This isn't about liberal or conservative bias, left-wing or right-wing propaganda. This is about something far more fundamental: the systematic prevention of ordinary humans from asking the right questions about their own origins and potential. Every major media corporation has editorial policies that discourage investigation into genetic differences between elite populations and everyone else. Every mainstream news organization treats ancient astronaut theories as fringe nonsense. Despite the overwhelming archaeological evidence, every documentary that gets close to exposing bloodline connections mysteriously loses funding or gets buried in distribution. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. When researchers like Zecharia Sitchin begin translating ancient tablets that describe genetic manipulation by non-human entities, their work gets marginalized by academic institutions controlled by the same bloodlines those tablets describe. When geneticists discover unusual markers in elite populations, their studies get their funding cut or their results get suppressed. When archaeologists uncover evidence that supports alternative theories of human development, their discoveries get locked away in private collections where the public will never see them. But it's not just about suppressing information. It's about actively conditioning human consciousness to reject certain possibilities before they can even be properly examined. They've weaponized skepticism itself, creating a culture where anyone who questions official narratives automatically gets labeled as mentally unstable, scientifically illiterate, or dangerously delusional. This psychological conditioning starts early and runs deep. Children are taught in schools controlled by bloodline families to accept certain assumptions about human nature, historical development, and the limits of human potential. They learn that extraordinary abilities are either fictional or pathological. They're conditioned to believe that hierarchical control is natural and necessary, that ordinary humans require elite guidance to function in complex societies, that questioning established authorities is a sign of mental instability rather than intellectual courage. By the time most people reach adulthood, they've been so thoroughly conditioned that they literally cannot process information that contradicts their programmed worldview. Show them genetic evidence of bloodline advantages, and they'll dismiss it as pseudoscience. Present them with archaeological discoveries that support ancient astronaut theories, and they'll laugh it off as fantasy. Explain the consistent patterns of power that have persisted across civilizations, and they'll attribute it to coincidence or natural social evolution. This isn't accidental ignorance, it's engineered cognitive limitation. The bloodline families have spent centuries perfecting methods of mental control that make physical coercion unnecessary. They don't need to imprison bodies when they can imprison minds. They don't need to suppress information when they can condition people to suppress their own curiosity. And the most insidious aspect of this control system is that it makes people complicit in their own domination. Ordinary humans defend the very systems that exploit them, attack researchers who try to expose the truth, and actively resist information that could liberate them from genetic tyranny that has controlled their species for millennia. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence of bloodline manipulation isn't in historical records or genetic studies. It's in the systematic suppression of human potential that has occurred over the past several centuries. Because if these families really do carry genetic modifications that originated with non-human entities, then their greatest fear wouldn't be economic competition or political challenges. Their greatest fear would be ordinary humans discovering and developing their own latent abilities. The ancient texts describe how the Watchers taught forbidden knowledge to humans, not just technical skills like metallurgy and astronomy, but deeper capacities like telepathy, remote viewing, and other psychic abilities that modern science dismisses as impossible. What if these abilities aren't supernatural phenomena, but natural human capacities that have been systematically suppressed by bloodlines who need to maintain their cognitive advantages? Consider how consistently certain types of research get marginalized or defunded. Studies of human consciousness that reveal extraordinary capabilities, research into psychic phenomena that demonstrate abilities mainstream science claims don't exist, investigation into meditation techniques that unlock cognitive potential beyond normal human parameters. Archaeological discoveries that suggest ancient humans possessed advanced knowledge and capabilities. The pattern isn't random. Every area of research that might reveal suppressed human potential gets attacked, ridiculed, or quietly eliminated. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because acknowledging that evidence would threaten the genetic hierarchy that has controlled human civilization for thousands of years. Think about the individuals throughout history who have displayed extraordinary abilities, inventors who revolutionized technology, mystics who demonstrated psychic capabilities, healers who achieved results that conventional medicine couldn't explain, visionaries who saw patterns and possibilities that escaped ordinary perception. What if these weren't rare mutations or genetic anomalies? What if they were glimpses of what ordinary humans could become if their development hadn't been systematically stunted by bloodlines who need to preserve their advantages? The implications are staggering. It would mean that human intellectual, psychic, and spiritual potential has been artificially limited for millennia. It would mean that what we consider normal human capability is actually the result of genetic and psychological suppression by hybrid entities who view enhanced humans as a threat to their dominance. And this suppression isn't just historical, it's ongoing and accelerating. The bloodline families can see that information is becoming harder to control, that independent researchers are making connections despite institutional opposition, that ordinary humans are beginning to ask questions that threaten their entire system of dominance. Their response reveals everything you need to know about what we're really dealing with. Instead of trying to elevate human consciousness or share their knowledge, they're implementing global control systems that would make ancient tyrannies look primitive, surveillance technologies that monitor every aspect of human behavior, social media platforms that manipulate thought patterns on unprecedented scales, economic structures that concentrate wealth and power in fewer hands than ever before. Political systems that offer the illusion of choice while ensuring that real authority remains with the same bloodlines. But perhaps most tellingly, they're accelerating programs designed to modify human genetics directly, not to enhance human potential, but to further limit it. Gene therapy research that could eliminate what they consider undesirable traits. Reproductive technologies that give them unprecedented control over human breeding. Pharmaceutical interventions that alter brain chemistry in ways that make people more compliant and less capable of independent thought. This isn't healthcare or scientific progress. It's the systematic genetic modification of ordinary humans by bloodlines who view themselves as a separate and superior species. They're not trying to help humanity evolve. They're trying to prevent evolution that might threaten their dominance. The ancient texts warned about this moment. They described a time when the descendants of the Watchers would attempt to remake humanity in their own image, when the genetic modifications that created the ruling bloodlines would be used to further suppress ordinary human potential. They called it the final harvest, when the hybrid entities would complete their domination of the purely human genome. That time might be now. The technologies exist, the control systems are in place. The bloodline families have never been more powerful or more coordinated in their efforts to reshape human civilization according to their specifications. But there's something they didn't anticipate, something that their genetic advantages and centuries of planning couldn't account for. The very technologies they've created to control human consciousness are also awakening it. The internet systems they use for surveillance are also enabling independent research and communication. The genetic studies they fund to understand their own advantages are also revealing the evidence of their non-human origins. Most importantly, the sheer scale of their control mechanisms is becoming so obvious that even conditioned humans are starting to notice when the same families control banking, media, politics, education, healthcare, and technology, when their genetic connections span continents and centuries, when their advantages over ordinary humans become too pronounced to hide. People begin to ask questions that no amount of psychological conditioning can suppress. The awakening is happening despite their best efforts to prevent it. Independent researchers are connecting dots that mainstream institutions refuse to acknowledge. Genetic studies are revealing anomalies that don't fit accepted models of human evolution. Archaeological discoveries are surfacing that support exactly the theories we've been exploring tonight. And ordinary humans are beginning to recognize that their supposed limitations might not be natural at all, but the result of systematic suppression by bloodlines who have never been entirely human to begin with. The question is no longer whether these bloodlines exist or whether they've shaped human civilization. The evidence is overwhelming. The patterns are undeniable. The genetic markers are detectable. The question is what ordinary humans are going to do with this knowledge, because understanding the truth about the Anunnaki bloodlines isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's the first step toward reclaiming human potential that has been suppressed for millennia. It's the beginning of recognizing that the limitations we've accepted as natural might actually be artificial constraints imposed by genetic entities who view themselves as humanity's rightful rulers. And once you understand that, once you really grasp the implications of what we've been discussing, everything changes. Your perception of politics, economics, education, media, healthcare, technology, everything shifts when you realize that these systems weren't designed by ordinary humans for ordinary humans, but by hybrid bloodlines to maintain their dominance over a species they consider inferior. The ancient tablets that started our journey tonight weren't just recording historical events. They were warning future generations about what would happen if the genetic modifications that created the Nephilim were allowed to persist unchecked. They were describing a future where hybrid entities would use their advantages to create systems of control so sophisticated that most humans wouldn't even recognize they were being dominated. That future is our present, but it doesn't have to be our destiny, because the same technologies that have revealed the evidence of bloodline dominance can also be used to overcome it. The same genetic knowledge that exposes their advantages can also help ordinary humans reclaim their suppressed potential. The war for humanity's future isn't being fought with weapons or armies. It's being fought in laboratories and research centers, in educational institutions and media corporations, in the very genetic code that determines what humans can become. And for the first time in thousands of years, ordinary humans have the tools to fight back, but only if they're willing to accept a truth that challenges everything they've been taught to believe about themselves, their origins, and their potential. Only if they're ready to confront bloodlines that have spent millennia perfecting the art of human control. Only if they understand that what's at stake isn't just political freedom or economic justice, but the very future of human consciousness itself. The Anunnaki bloodlines have had their turn shaping human civilization. The question is whether ordinary humans are ready to take it back. The genetic evidence isn't just hiding in genealogical records or ancient tablets. It's written in the very DNA of modern populations, creating patterns that mainstream science struggles to explain. When independent researchers began conducting unauthorized genetic studies on blood samples from elite families, what they discovered should have made international headlines. Instead, the studies were suppressed, the researchers discredited, and the samples mysteriously disappeared from laboratory storage facilities. But some of the data survived, hidden in encrypted files and protected by researchers who understood the implications of what they'd found. The results paint a picture that challenges everything we think we know about human genetic diversity and the supposed equality of our species. Elite bloodlines consistently show genetic markers that appear nowhere else in human populations. Not variations or mutations, entirely unique sequences that don't match any known human genome. These aren't the kind of differences you'd expect from isolated breeding populations or genetic drift. They're systematic modifications that suggest deliberate intervention at the chromosomal level. More disturbing still, these genetic anomalies cluster around specific capabilities. Enhanced cognitive processing speed that allows for information integration at superhuman levels. Extended telomeres that correlate with dramatically increased lifespans. Neurological structures that enable what can only be described as psychic abilities, remote viewing, telepathic communication, precognitive awareness of future events. The Bloodline families know about these studies. They've been conducting their own genetic research for decades, using resources and technologies that make government programs look primitive. Private laboratories in Switzerland, underground research facilities in remote locations, genetic databases that track bloodline purity across multiple generations. They're not just preserving their advantages, they're enhancing them. Consider the recent advances in genetic engineering that have emerged from research institutions controlled by these families. CRISPR technology that allows for precise genetic modification. Gene therapy techniques that can alter human DNA in living subjects. Reproductive technologies that enable genetic selection and enhancement on unprecedented scales. These aren't humanitarian medical advances, they're tools for biological warfare against ordinary humans. The most chilling aspect of their genetic research isn't what they're adding to their own bloodlines, but what they're removing from everyone else's. Targeted gene therapies disguised as vaccines that disable specific human capabilities. Pharmaceutical interventions that alter brain chemistry in ways that reduce cognitive potential. Environmental toxins that cause genetic damage in ordinary populations while leaving bloodline families mysteriously unaffected. They're not just maintaining their genetic advantages. They're actively degrading human potential to ensure their dominance remains unchallenged. Every generation of ordinary humans becomes a little less capable, a little more dependent, a little further removed from the abilities that might allow them to recognize and resist bloodline control. But the genetic manipulation goes beyond individual capabilities. They're altering human reproductive patterns, social behaviors, and even spiritual awareness. Through systematic genetic modification, the rising rates of infertility in developed nations, the increasing prevalence of psychological disorders that make people easier to control, the apparent degradation of human intuition and psychic sensitivity. These aren't natural evolutionary trends. They're the result of deliberate genetic warfare against ordinary human populations. The evidence appears in unexpected places. Medical studies that reveal unusual genetic resistance to certain diseases in elite populations. Genealogical databases that show impossible longevity patterns in specific bloodlines. Neurological research that demonstrates cognitive abilities in bloodline families that exceed normal human parameters by orders of magnitude. Most tellingly, the genetic evidence explains why certain families have maintained power across civilizations that span thousands of years. It's not just wealth or political connections, it's biological superiority that gives them advantages ordinary humans cannot overcome through effort or intelligence alone. They're literally a different species masquerading as human, using genetic camouflage to hide their true nature while systematically exploiting their purely human subjects. The ancient Sumerian tablets describe this process in detail. The Anunnaki didn't just create hybrid offspring, they established genetic castes designed to maintain permanent hierarchy. The tablets speak of genetic modifications that would ensure the hybrid bloodlines could never be challenged by their human subjects. Alterations that would make resistance not just difficult, but biologically impossible. And those modifications persist today, encoded in bloodlines that have spent millennia perfecting their genetic advantages while systematically degrading human potential. The playing field isn't just uneven, it's been deliberately tilted to ensure that ordinary humans can never compete with entities who possess capabilities that originated with non-human intelligence. This genetic warfare operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical modifications that enhance strength, endurance, and longevity. Cognitive alterations that enable processing speeds and pattern recognition beyond normal human limits. Psychic enhancements that allow for abilities mainstream science claims don't exist. And perhaps most importantly, genetic programming that makes bloodline individuals naturally suited for leadership and control while making ordinary humans instinctively submissive to their authority. The implications extend far beyond individual advantages. If these bloodlines carry genetic modifications that originated with extraterrestrial or interdimensional entities, then human civilization has been shaped by non-human intelligence for thousands of years. Every major historical development, every technological advance, every social structure that has emerged during recorded history has been guided by beings whose genetic heritage traces back to sources that existed before purely human consciousness evolved. But the genetic evidence also reveals something the bloodline families don't want ordinary humans to discover. The modifications work both ways. The same genetic alterations that give them advantages also create vulnerabilities that purely human genetics don't possess, specific frequencies that disrupt their enhanced neural patterns, genetic sequences that can be targeted to neutralize their advantages, biological weaknesses that result from their non-human heritage. More importantly, the genetic research reveals that ordinary human DNA contains latent capabilities that have been systematically suppressed but not eliminated. The potential for enhanced cognitive function, extended lifespans, and psychic abilities exist within normal human genetics. It's just been turned off through deliberate modification and environmental manipulation. The bloodline families understand this, which is why they've accelerated their genetic warfare programs in recent decades. They know that if ordinary humans ever discovered and activated their suppressed genetic potential, the balance of power could shift within a single generation. They're racing to complete their genetic domination before humanity awakens to its true capabilities. But awakening is exactly what's beginning to happen. Independent researchers are developing techniques to reactivate suppressed human genes. Alternative health practitioners are discovering methods to reverse genetic damage caused by bloodline manipulation. Consciousness researchers are finding ways to unlock psychic abilities that have been dormant in human populations for millennia. The genetic prison that has contained human potential for thousands of years is beginning to crack, and the bloodline families know it. Their response reveals everything you need to understand about the true nature of the conflict we're facing. They're not trying to compete with awakening humans or negotiate some kind of peaceful coexistence. They're implementing final solutions designed to eliminate the genetic potential of ordinary humans permanently. Global vaccination programs that alter human DNA in irreversible ways, environmental modifications that cause specific genetic damage to non-bloodline populations, reproductive technologies that give them direct control over human breeding and genetic development. This isn't about maintaining their advantages. It's about preventing ordinary humans from ever developing the capabilities that would allow them to challenge bloodline dominance. They're attempting to complete a genetic genocide that began thousands of years ago using modern technology to finish what the Anunnaki started when they first modified human genetics to create a slave species. But the same technologies that enable their genetic warfare also provide the tools for genetic liberation. The human genome can be repaired, enhanced, and optimized using techniques that are becoming available to independent researchers. The suppressed capabilities can be reactivated, the damage can be reversed, and the genetic advantages can be democratized rather than concentrated in bloodline families. The question is whether ordinary humans will recognize what's happening and take action before the genetic modifications become irreversible. Because once the bloodline families complete their genetic domination, once they've permanently altered human DNA to eliminate the potential for resistance, the window for liberation will close forever. The evidence is all around us, encoded in genetic studies that reveal impossible patterns, hidden in medical research that demonstrates bloodline advantages, visible in the systematic degradation of human potential that has accelerated over recent decades. The genetic war for humanity's future is happening right now in laboratories and research centers in the very DNA that determines what humans can become. And the outcome of that war will determine whether the next generation of humans inherits the suppressed potential of their ancestors, or whether they become the final product of a genetic modification program designed to create permanent biological slavery to bloodlines that were never entirely human to begin with. The ancient tablets that began our investigation tonight weren't just recording history. They were documenting the beginning of a genetic experiment that continues to this day. An experiment designed to create a hybrid ruling class with permanent advantages over their purely human subjects. An experiment that has shaped every aspect of human civilization for thousands of years. But experiments can be reversed. Genetic modifications can be undone. Suppressed capabilities can be reactivated. The question is whether humanity will awaken to its true potential before the bloodline families complete their genetic domination of our species. The war for human consciousness isn't just about information or political control. It's about the very genetic code that determines what humans can become. And for the first time in millennia, ordinary humans have the tools to fight back. The question is whether they'll use them before it's too late, because the Anunnaki bloodlines have spent thousands of years perfecting their genetic advantages and suppressing human potential. But they've also created the technologies that could liberate humanity from their control. The same genetic engineering that maintains their dominance could restore human capabilities that have been suppressed since the dawn of civilization. The choice is ours, but the window is closing fast. And once it closes, the genetic future of humanity will belong permanently to bloodlines that trace their origins to entities that were never human at all. The genetic manipulation we've been discussing isn't some distant historical curiosity. It's an active, ongoing operation that reaches into every aspect of modern life. And nowhere is this more evident than in the systematic targeting of human consciousness itself. Because if you possess genetic advantages that trace back to non-human entities, your greatest threat isn't military opposition or economic competition. Your greatest threat is ordinary humans discovering their own suppressed capabilities and learning to use them. The bloodline families understand this perfectly. They've spent centuries developing what can only be described as consciousness warfare, systematic attacks on human awareness designed to keep ordinary people in a state of mental and spiritual numbness that prevents them from accessing their latent abilities. These aren't random social trends or the inevitable result of technological progress. They're carefully orchestrated programs designed to lobotomize human potential before it can threaten bloodline dominance. Consider the fluoride that's been added to water supplies across the developed world for decades. Officially, it's there to prevent tooth decay, but independent research reveals something far more sinister. Fluoride accumulates in the pineal gland, the small organ in the brain that ancient traditions identified as the seat of psychic awareness and spiritual insight. The chemical literally calcifies this gland, blocking the neural pathways that enable enhanced consciousness and psychic abilities. The bloodline families know this. Their private water supplies are meticulously filtered to remove every trace of fluoride and other consciousness-suppressing chemicals. While ordinary humans consume neurotoxins with every glass of water, the genetic elites preserve their enhanced cognitive abilities by avoiding the very substances they've introduced into public water systems. But fluoride is just the beginning. The electromagnetic radiation from cellular networks, Wi-Fi systems, and smart devices creates a constant interference pattern that disrupts human brainwave frequencies. These aren't accidental side effects of modern technology. They're deliberate features designed to prevent ordinary humans from achieving the meditative states that unlock suppressed genetic potential. Independent researchers have discovered that specific frequencies can activate dormant DNA sequences, enhance cognitive function, and enable psychic abilities that mainstream science claims don't exist. The bloodline families have weaponized this knowledge, using technology to broadcast interference patterns that block these beneficial frequencies while amplifying signals that keep human consciousness trapped in lower vibrational states. The evidence appears in unexpected places. Studies showing dramatic increases in attention disorders, anxiety, and depression that correlate precisely with the rollout of new wireless technologies. Research revealing that human creativity and problem-solving abilities decline in direct proportion to electromagnetic exposure. Medical data demonstrating that the same brain regions affected by consciousness-suppressing frequencies are those associated with psychic abilities and enhanced intuition. Most tellingly, the bloodline families themselves live in carefully shielded environments that protect them from the very radiation they've saturated the general population with. Their homes, offices, and private facilities use advanced shielding technologies that block electromagnetic interference while amplifying the frequencies that enhance cognitive function and psychic awareness. They're not just preserving their genetic advantages, they're creating environmental conditions that suppress ordinary human consciousness while optimizing their own enhanced capabilities. It's a form of technological genocide that targets the very essence of human awareness, ensuring that ordinary people remain trapped in mental states that make resistance impossible. The pharmaceutical industry provides another vector for consciousness suppression. The antidepressants, anxiety medications, and psychiatric drugs that have become ubiquitous in modern society don't just treat symptoms, they fundamentally alter brain chemistry in ways that block access to enhanced states of consciousness. These medications specifically target the neurotransmitter systems that enable psychic abilities, spiritual awareness, and the kind of expanded thinking that might allow ordinary humans to recognize their true situation. The bloodline families who control pharmaceutical corporations understand exactly what these drugs do to human consciousness. Internal documents reveal research programs specifically designed to identify and suppress the neurological pathways associated with enhanced awareness. They're not trying to help people achieve mental health. They're chemically lobotomizing entire populations to prevent the emergence of consciousness that might threaten their dominance. Meanwhile, these same families use advanced nootropics, consciousness-enhancing compounds, and genetic therapies that optimize their own cognitive function. They have access to technologies that enhance memory, increase processing speed, and unlock psychic abilities that ordinary humans don't even know are possible. The cognitive gap between bloodline elites and chemically suppressed ordinary humans grows wider with each generation. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of their consciousness warfare is how they've corrupted the very spiritual traditions that once helped humans access their enhanced abilities. Ancient meditation techniques, energy practices, and consciousness-expanding methods have been systematically distorted, commercialized, and stripped of their original power. The New Age movement, which appears to promote spiritual development, is actually a bloodline-controlled operation designed to misdirect human spiritual seeking into harmless channels. Instead of teaching techniques that actually unlock genetic potential, New Age practices keep people trapped in fantasy-based thinking that prevents real development. Instead of accessing genuine psychic abilities, practitioners get lost in imaginary experiences that feel meaningful but produce no actual enhancement of consciousness. The bloodline families have taken every authentic spiritual tradition and created corrupted versions that lead ordinary humans away from real power rather than toward it. Christianity was transformed from a system of consciousness expansion into a religion of submission and dependency. Buddhism was changed from a method of achieving enhanced awareness into a philosophy of passive acceptance. Indigenous shamanic traditions were either destroyed entirely or co-opted into harmless therapeutic practices. This isn't accidental cultural evolution. It's systematic spiritual warfare designed to prevent ordinary humans from accessing the consciousness techniques that could activate their suppressed genetic potential. The bloodline families understand that human DNA contains the capacity for abilities that would make their technological control systems obsolete. So they've created spiritual distractions that keep people busy with ineffective practices, while the real techniques remain hidden in secret societies controlled by the bloodlines themselves. The educational system provides another layer of consciousness suppression. Children are conditioned from an early age to think in ways that make enhanced awareness impossible. The focus on left brain analytical thinking, the suppression of creativity and intuition, the emphasis on competition rather than cooperation. These aren't random pedagogical choices. They're deliberate programming designed to prevent young humans from developing the cognitive patterns that enable psychic abilities and expanded consciousness. Meanwhile, bloodline children receive entirely different educations in private institutions that cultivate exactly the abilities being suppressed in public schools. They learn meditation techniques that enhance cognitive function. They study consciousness development methods that unlock genetic potential. They practice psychic abilities that mainstream education claims are impossible. By adulthood, the cognitive gap between bloodline individuals and ordinary humans has become insurmountable, not because of genetic differences alone, but because of systematic consciousness suppression that prevents ordinary humans from accessing capabilities that exist within their own DNA. The media systems that shape human perception complete the consciousness suppression program. Television programming specifically uses frequencies and imagery designed to induce trance states that make viewers susceptible to suggestion while blocking access to enhanced awareness. The content itself is carefully crafted to promote emotional states, fear, anger, desire, despair that keep consciousness trapped in lower vibrational frequencies where psychic abilities cannot function. Social media platforms use sophisticated algorithms to identify individuals who show signs of awakening consciousness and target them with content designed to redirect their attention into harmless channels. Anyone who begins asking the right questions gets flooded with disinformation, conspiracy theories that lead nowhere, and emotional manipulation designed to prevent clear thinking. The bloodline families who control these platforms understand exactly how consciousness works and how to manipulate it. They use advanced psychological techniques, subliminal programming, and frequency manipulation to keep ordinary humans trapped in mental states that make resistance impossible while optimizing conditions for their own enhanced awareness. But the most disturbing aspect of their consciousness warfare is how they've turned ordinary humans into unwitting participants in their own suppression. People defend the very systems that are lobotomizing them. They attack researchers who try to expose consciousness suppression techniques. They voluntarily consume the chemicals, expose themselves to the frequencies, and engage in the practices that prevent them from accessing their true potential. This isn't accidental ignorance, it's programmed complicity. The bloodline families have created psychological conditioning so sophisticated that ordinary humans police their own consciousness, suppressing thoughts and experiences that might lead to genuine awakening. They've weaponized human social instincts, making conformity and consensus more important than truth or personal development. The result is a population that has been systematically disconnected from their own genetic heritage, unaware of capabilities that should be natural to human consciousness, trapped in mental states that make them easy to control and impossible to awaken. It's the completion of the genetic modification program that began with the Anunnaki, the creation of a permanently suppressed human subspecies that lacks the consciousness necessary to recognize or resist their domination by hybrid bloodlines. But consciousness suppression, like genetic manipulation, can be reversed. The same technologies that enable bloodline control can be used to restore human awareness. Independent researchers are developing techniques to clear consciousness, suppressing chemicals from the body, shield against electromagnetic interference, and reactivate the neural pathways that enable enhanced awareness. More importantly, they're rediscovering the authentic spiritual techniques that the bloodline families have spent centuries corrupting and hiding. Methods that actually work to unlock genetic potential, activate psychic abilities, and expand consciousness beyond the limitations that have been artificially imposed on human awareness. The question is whether ordinary humans will recognize what's been done to their consciousness and take action to restore their natural capabilities before the suppression becomes irreversible. Because the bloodline families aren't just maintaining their advantages, they're implementing final solutions designed to permanently lobotomize human consciousness. Global electromagnetic control systems that will make current interference patterns look primitive. Genetic modifications disguised as medical treatments that will eliminate the DNA sequences associated with enhanced awareness. Chemical programs that will cause irreversible damage to the brain structures that enable psychic abilities. They understand that consciousness is the ultimate battlefield. If they can permanently suppress human awareness, if they can eliminate the capacity for enhanced consciousness from human genetics, then their dominance becomes absolute and eternal. No amount of political resistance or economic opposition can challenge rulers who possess consciousness abilities that their subjects cannot even comprehend. But consciousness warfare cuts both ways. The same techniques that suppress ordinary human awareness can be used to enhance it beyond anything the bloodline families possess. Because while they carry genetic modifications from non-human entities, ordinary humans carry the original template, the pure genetic potential that existed before those modifications were introduced. And that original template, when properly activated, may contain capabilities that exceed even the enhanced abilities of hybrid bloodlines. Capabilities that have been suppressed for so long that even the bloodline families have forgotten they exist. Capabilities that could shift the balance of power in ways that no one has imagined. The consciousness war for humanity's future is happening right now in the neural pathways of every human brain, in the genetic sequences that determine what consciousness can become. And for the first time in millennia, ordinary humans have access to the knowledge and techniques necessary to fight back. The question is whether they'll use them before the bloodline families complete their consciousness suppression programs. Because once human awareness is permanently lobotomized, once the genetic capacity for enhanced consciousness is eliminated from ordinary human DNA, the window for liberation will close forever. The ancient texts warned about this moment. They described a time when the descendants of the Watchers would attempt to permanently suppress human consciousness, completing the genetic modification program that began with the creation of the Nephilim. They called it the final binding, when human awareness would be chained so completely that liberation would become impossible. That time is now. The technologies exist. The suppression programs are active. The consciousness warfare is accelerating toward a conclusion that will determine the future of human awareness for generations to come. But the same ancient texts also describe the possibility of awakening, a time when ordinary humans would rediscover their suppressed capabilities and reclaim their genetic heritage from the bloodlines that have controlled them for millennia. They spoke of consciousness techniques that could unlock abilities beyond anything the hybrid rulers possessed. Genetic potential that could transform ordinary humans into something greater than their oppressors ever imagined. The choice is ours, but the battle is being fought in the realm of consciousness itself, in the very awareness that determines what humans can become. And the outcome of that battle will determine whether future generations inherit the suppressed potential of their ancestors, or whether they become the final product of a consciousness suppression program designed to create permanent mental slavery to bloodlines that were never entirely human to begin with. The war for human consciousness isn't coming. It's here. And every human being alive today is both a battlefield and a potential warrior in a conflict that will determine the genetic and spiritual future of our entire species. The consciousness suppression programs we've been discussing aren't just targeting individual awareness. They're systematically dismantling the collective human memory that might allow our species to recognize what we've lost. Because if ordinary humans ever remembered what their ancestors were capable of before the genetic modifications began, if they understood the true scope of abilities that have been bred out of general populations, the entire system of bloodline control would collapse within a generation. This is why certain archaeological discoveries get buried, why ancient texts disappear into private collections, why researchers who get too close to uncomfortable truths find their careers destroyed or their lives cut short. The bloodline families aren't just protecting their current advantages, they're erasing the evidence that ordinary humans were once capable of abilities that made genetic hierarchy unnecessary. Consider the megalithic structures that appear across every continent on Earth. Massive stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons, moved and positioned with precision that modern engineering can barely match, created by civilizations that supposedly lacked advanced technology. The official explanation that ancient humans accomplished these feats through primitive methods and brute force becomes laughable when you examine the actual evidence. These structures weren't built by ordinary humans using conventional techniques. They were created by individuals who possessed abilities that have been systematically bred out of modern populations. abilities that allowed them to manipulate matter and energy in ways that seem impossible to genetically suppressed humans today. The bloodline families know this. Their private archives contain detailed records of the technologies and abilities that existed before the genetic suppression programs began. They understand exactly what ordinary humans were capable of when their genetic potential remained intact, and they've spent centuries ensuring that this knowledge never reaches public awareness. But traces of the truth survive in unexpected places. Ancient texts that describe humans levitating massive stones through sound frequencies, archaeological evidence of precision cutting and drilling that exceeds modern capabilities, genetic studies that reveal how dramatically human cognitive potential has declined over the past several thousand years. Most tellingly, indigenous traditions around the world preserve memories of ancestors who possessed abilities that modern humans consider supernatural. The capacity to communicate telepathically across vast distances, the ability to heal through energy manipulation, techniques for accessing information from what they called the Akashic Records, a quantum field containing all knowledge that exists or has ever existed. These weren't primitive superstitions or mythological fantasies. They were descriptions of natural human capabilities that existed before genetic modification programs reduced ordinary humans to their current limited state. Capabilities that the bloodline families have preserved within their own genetics, while systematically eliminating them from general populations. The evidence appears in the strangest places. Medical studies showing that certain bloodline families possess neural structures that don't appear in normal human anatomy. Archaeological discoveries of ancient skulls with cranial features that suggest dramatically enhanced brain capacity. Genetic research revealing that human intelligence has actually declined over recorded history, not evolved upward as conventional theories suggest. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the rare individuals who somehow escape the genetic suppression and retain fragments of original human capabilities. The savants who demonstrate impossible mathematical abilities without training. The psychics who consistently demonstrate telepathic and precognitive abilities under controlled conditions. The healers who achieve results that conventional medicine cannot explain or replicate. These aren't genetic mutations or anomalies. They're glimpses of what ordinary humans were designed to be before the bloodline families began their genetic modification programs. They represent the suppressed potential that exists within human DNA, waiting to be reactivated by individuals who understand how to bypass the genetic locks that keep these abilities dormant. The bloodline families understand this threat perfectly, which is why they've created entire industries designed to discredit, marginalize, and eliminate individuals who display enhanced abilities. The medical establishment that pathologizes psychic experiences as mental illness. The educational system that identifies and suppresses gifted children who show signs of unusual capabilities. The media apparatus that ridicules and dismisses evidence of human potential that exceeds accepted parameters. They've turned the rare appearance of enhanced abilities into proof of pathology rather than evidence of suppressed human heritage. Anyone who demonstrates telepathic abilities gets labeled as delusional. Individuals who show precognitive awareness are dismissed as fantasists. People who achieve healing results through energy manipulation are attacked as frauds or charlatans. This systematic suppression of enhanced individuals serves multiple purposes. It prevents ordinary humans from recognizing that these abilities are natural to their species. It eliminates potential threats to bloodline dominance before they can develop their full capabilities. And it maintains the illusion that genetic hierarchy is based on natural superiority rather than artificial modification. But the suppression is becoming harder to maintain as more individuals begin displaying abilities that shouldn't exist according to official models of human potential. Independent researchers are documenting cases of spontaneous psychic awakening, genetic activation events that unlock dormant DNA sequences, and consciousness expansion experiences that restore capabilities that have been suppressed for generations. The bloodline families are responding with increasing desperation, accelerating their genetic modification programs and consciousness suppression techniques. They understand that if even a small percentage of ordinary humans activate their suppressed potential, the balance of power could shift irreversibly. Their advantages depend on maintaining a population that doesn't know what it's capable of becoming. This is why the current moment is so critical. We're witnessing the convergence of multiple factors that could trigger mass awakening of human potential. Advanced technologies that can detect and measure psychic abilities. Genetic techniques that can identify and reactivate suppressed DNA sequences. Consciousness methods that can bypass the mental conditioning that keeps abilities dormant. Most importantly, we're seeing the emergence of information networks that allow ordinary humans to share knowledge and experiences despite bloodline control of mainstream media and educational institutions. For the first time in millennia, individuals who display enhanced abilities can connect with others who share similar experiences, creating communities of practice that support the development of suppressed capabilities. The bloodline families recognize this threat, which is why they're implementing increasingly aggressive countermeasures. Global surveillance systems designed to identify individuals who show signs of genetic activation. Targeted electromagnetic weapons that can disrupt the neural patterns associated with psychic abilities. Pharmaceutical interventions disguised as mental health treatments that chemically suppress consciousness expansion, but they're also revealing their desperation through the very intensity of their response. The more aggressively they attack enhanced individuals, the more obvious it becomes that these abilities represent a genuine threat to their dominance. The more sophisticated their suppression techniques become, the clearer it is that they're fighting against capabilities that could fundamentally alter the balance of power. And here's what they didn't anticipate. The same technologies they've created to suppress human potential can also be used to enhance it. Genetic engineering techniques that can reactivate dormant DNA sequences. Electromagnetic technologies that can stimulate rather than suppress psychic abilities. Pharmaceutical compounds that can optimize rather than diminish consciousness function. Independent researchers are already developing these applications, working outside the bloodline-controlled institutions to create tools for human enhancement rather than suppression. Underground networks of scientists, consciousness researchers, and genetic engineers who understand that the future of humanity depends on reclaiming capabilities that have been artificially suppressed for thousands of years. The race is on between those who want to complete the genetic subjugation of humanity and those who want to restore human potential to its original levels. Between bloodlines that seek to maintain their artificial advantages and ordinary humans who are beginning to understand what they've lost and how to get it back. The outcome of this race will determine whether future generations inherit a world where genetic hierarchy is permanent and unassailable, or whether they reclaim abilities that make such hierarchy obsolete. Whether consciousness remains trapped within the limitations imposed by bloodline suppression programs, or whether it expands beyond anything that hybrid rulers can control or comprehend, because the ultimate secret that the bloodline families have spent millennia hiding isn't just that they possess genetic advantages over ordinary humans. It's that ordinary humans, when their suppressed potential is fully activated, possess capabilities that exceed anything the hybrid bloodlines can achieve. The original human template contains genetic sequences that were designed for abilities beyond what non-human modification could create. This is why they've worked so desperately to suppress human potential rather than simply competing with it. They know that if ordinary humans ever activated their full genetic heritage, the bloodlines would become obsolete overnight. Their artificial advantages would be meaningless compared to the natural capabilities that exist within unmodified human DNA. The ancient texts hinted at this possibility. They described humans who could manipulate matter through consciousness alone, who could access infinite knowledge through quantum field interfaces, who could transcend physical limitations through genetic optimization that no external modification could match. They spoke of human potential that exceeded even the abilities of the beings who created the Nephilim bloodlines. That potential still exists, encoded within the DNA of every ordinary human, waiting to be activated by individuals who understand how to bypass the genetic locks and consciousness barriers that keep it suppressed. The question is whether enough humans will awaken to their true capabilities before the bloodline families complete their final suppression programs. because we're approaching a point of no return. The technologies exist to permanently alter human genetics in ways that would eliminate the potential for enhanced abilities forever. The consciousness suppression systems are becoming sophisticated enough to prevent awakening on a species-wide scale. The window for human liberation is closing with each passing day, but it's still open. The capabilities still exist within human DNA. The techniques for activation are being developed and shared despite bloodline attempts at suppression. The awakening is happening person by person, ability by ability, consciousness by consciousness. The war for humanity's genetic and spiritual future isn't just about political control or economic dominance. It's about determining what humans are allowed to become. Whether we remain trapped within the limitations imposed by bloodlines that view us as an inferior subspecies, or whether we reclaim the capabilities that were always meant to be our birthright, the choice is ours. But the time for choosing is running out faster than most people realize. The bloodline families have spent thousands of years preparing for this moment when their genetic modification programs would reach completion and human potential would be suppressed permanently. They didn't expect resistance. They didn't anticipate that their own technologies would provide the tools for human liberation. They didn't foresee that the very consciousness they've tried to suppress would begin awakening despite their best efforts at control. The awakening is happening. The question is whether it will happen fast enough and spread far enough to prevent the final genetic enslavement of humanity by bloodlines that were never entirely human to begin with. And that question will be answered not by governments or institutions, but by individual humans who decide to reclaim their suppressed heritage and activate abilities that have been dormant for thousands of years. By people who choose to remember what their ancestors were capable of and refuse to accept the genetic limitations that have been artificially imposed on their species. The war for human consciousness is being fought in the DNA of every person alive today, and the outcome will determine whether the future belongs to hybrid bloodlines who view themselves as humanity's genetic superiors, or to ordinary humans who are finally ready to become everything they were originally designed to be. The awakening isn't happening in laboratories or research facilities controlled by institutional power. It's occurring in the most unexpected places. In suburban bedrooms where individuals experience spontaneous consciousness expansion, in remote locations where small groups practice techniques that seem to activate dormant genetic sequences, in online communities where people share experiences that mainstream science insists are impossible. These aren't organized movements or coordinated resistance efforts. They're spontaneous eruptions of human potential breaking through the suppression barriers that have contained it for millennia. Individuals who suddenly find themselves capable of abilities they never knew existed. People who discover they can perceive information beyond the range of normal human senses. Communities that develop healing capabilities that conventional medicine cannot explain or replicate. The pattern is accelerating. Reports flood in from across the globe of individuals experiencing what can only be described as genetic activation events. Moments when dormant DNA sequences suddenly become active, unlocking capabilities that were thought to be permanently suppressed. These aren't gradual developments or the result of intensive training programs. They're sudden, dramatic expansions of human potential that occur without warning or apparent cause. But there is a cause, and it's one that the bloodline families never anticipated. The same electromagnetic technologies they've used to suppress human consciousness are creating unexpected resonance patterns in certain individuals. The genetic modification programs designed to eliminate enhanced abilities are triggering reverse activation in people whose DNA contains specific sequences. The consciousness suppression chemicals are causing paradoxical reactions in individuals whose neural chemistry differs from standard human parameters. It's as if the human genetic code contains built-in resistance mechanisms that activate under extreme suppression conditions, fail-safe systems that trigger when the original human template is threatened with permanent destruction. Emergency protocols encoded into DNA that respond to species-level threats by unlocking capabilities that were meant to remain dormant until they were needed for survival. The bloodline families are discovering that their suppression programs are not just failing, they're backfiring in ways that threaten their entire control structure. The more aggressively they attempt to suppress human potential, the more violently it erupts in resistant individuals. The more sophisticated their genetic modification programs become, the more dramatically they trigger activation responses in people whose DNA retains original human sequences. This isn't random genetic drift or evolutionary adaptation. This is systematic awakening of capabilities that have been waiting for thousands of years for the right conditions to emerge. Abilities that were designed to activate when humanity faced extinction-level threats to its genetic heritage. Potential that was programmed to surface when the species needed to defend itself against forces that sought to permanently alter what humans could become. The evidence appears in the strangest contexts. Children born with abilities that exceed anything documented in medical literature. Adults who suddenly develop psychic capabilities following exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies. Communities where healing abilities spread like contagion, person to person, family to family, until entire populations display enhanced consciousness that shouldn't exist according to official models of human development. But perhaps the most disturbing development for bloodline control systems is the emergence of individuals who seem immune to the suppression techniques that work on ordinary humans. People whose consciousness remains clear despite exposure to chemicals that should lobotomize awareness. Individuals whose genetic expression continues to enhance despite electromagnetic interference designed to prevent DNA activation. Communities that maintain psychic abilities despite pharmaceutical interventions that should eliminate enhanced consciousness. These immune populations aren't random genetic anomalies. They represent the emergence of humans whose DNA has activated protective sequences that make them resistant to the modification programs that have controlled their species for millennia. They're living proof that the original human template contains capabilities that exceed anything the bloodline families possess, even with their non-human genetic enhancements. The implications terrify bloodline strategists who have spent centuries perfecting control systems based on the assumption that ordinary humans would remain genetically suppressed indefinitely. If immune populations continue to expand, if resistance to suppression techniques spreads through normal human breeding patterns, the entire foundation of bloodline dominance could collapse within a few generations. This explains the acceleration of final solution programs we're witnessing across every sector controlled by bloodline families. Global vaccination campaigns designed to permanently alter human DNA before immune populations can expand. Electromagnetic control systems that will make current suppression technologies look primitive. Chemical programs that target the specific genetic sequences associated with resistance to modification. They understand that they're facing an extinction-level threat to their own dominance, not from external enemies or competing power structures, but from the activation of human potential that was always meant to exceed their artificial advantages. They're racing to complete their genetic domination before ordinary humans discover what they're truly capable of becoming. But the race may already be lost because the same technologies that enable their control systems also accelerate the awakening process in resistant individuals. The global communication networks they use for surveillance also allow immune populations to find each other and share techniques for genetic activation. The genetic research they fund to enhance their own capabilities also reveals the methods that can unlock suppressed human potential. Most critically, they've created environmental conditions that trigger exactly the emergency response mechanisms encoded within original human DNA. The threats to species survival, the systematic suppression of genetic heritage, the attempts to permanently alter human consciousness. These are precisely the conditions that activate the fail-safe systems designed to preserve and enhance human potential when it faces extinction. The awakening isn't just happening despite their suppression efforts, it's happening because of them. Every technique they use to prevent human genetic activation creates the pressure that forces dormant capabilities to emerge. Every chemical they introduce to suppress consciousness triggers resistance mechanisms that unlock enhanced awareness. Every electromagnetic frequency they deploy to control human behavior creates resonance patterns that activate psychic abilities. They've inadvertently created the perfect conditions for mass awakening of human potential that has been suppressed for thousands of years. The very intensity of their control efforts is generating the pressure needed to break through genetic barriers that have contained human capabilities since the original modification programs began. And once awakening reaches critical mass, once enough humans activate their suppressed potential, the balance of power shifts in ways that make bloodline advantages irrelevant. Enhanced consciousness that can perceive deception regardless of how sophisticated the propaganda. Psychic abilities that can detect manipulation despite advanced psychological techniques. Genetic capabilities that exceed anything hybrid bloodlines can achieve through non-human modification. The ancient texts describe this possibility as the Great Reversal, a time when suppressed human potential would awaken with such force that it would overthrow the genetic hierarchy that had controlled civilization for millennia. They spoke of humans who would remember their original capabilities and reclaim abilities that made external control impossible. They predicted an awakening that would restore human consciousness to levels that exceeded even the enhanced awareness of hybrid rulers. That awakening appears to be beginning now, triggered by the very suppression programs designed to prevent it. The bloodline families who thought they were completing their genetic domination may actually be catalyzing the liberation of human potential they've spent millennia trying to suppress. But awakening alone isn't enough. Enhanced individuals must understand what they're facing, why their abilities have been suppressed, and how to use their capabilities to protect themselves and others from genetic modification programs that continue to threaten human heritage. They need to recognize that their awakening isn't random good fortune, but the activation of emergency systems designed to preserve human potential when it faces extinction. Most importantly, they need to understand that their enhanced abilities come with responsibilities that extend beyond personal development or spiritual growth. They're the immune system of human consciousness, activated to defend their species against genetic warfare that threatens to permanently alter what humans can become. The war for humanity's genetic future isn't being fought in government buildings or corporate boardrooms. It's happening in the DNA of individuals whose suppressed potential is breaking through barriers that were meant to contain it forever. It's occurring in the consciousness of people who are remembering abilities they never knew they possessed. It's taking place in communities where enhanced capabilities are spreading despite every effort to prevent their emergence. And the outcome of that war will be determined not by the bloodline families who have controlled human civilization for thousands of years, but by ordinary humans who are discovering they were never ordinary at all. By individuals whose awakening consciousness exceeds anything their supposed genetic superiors can comprehend or control. The question is no longer whether human potential will awaken despite suppression efforts. The evidence shows it's already happening, accelerating with each passing day as more individuals break through genetic barriers that were thought to be permanent. The question is whether awakening humans will understand their situation quickly enough to prevent the completion of final modification programs designed to make their emerging abilities irrelevant. Because while human potential is awakening, bloodline families are implementing increasingly desperate measures to neutralize enhanced individuals before they can develop their full capabilities. Targeted elimination programs disguised as medical treatments, genetic modification techniques designed to reverse activation sequences, consciousness suppression technologies that specifically target the neural patterns associated with enhanced awareness. The race between human awakening and final genetic suppression is happening right now in real time in the bodies and minds of individuals who may not even realize they're participating in a conflict that will determine the future of human consciousness. The outcome will decide whether humanity reclaims its suppressed heritage or becomes permanently enslaved by bloodlines that were never entirely human to begin with. And that outcome depends on whether enough humans awaken quickly enough to recognize what they're truly capable of becoming, understand why those capabilities have been suppressed, and learn to use their enhanced abilities to protect their species from genetic modification programs that threaten to eliminate human potential forever. The awakening is real. The capabilities are emerging. The question is whether humanity will recognize what's happening and act to preserve its genetic heritage before the window of opportunity closes permanently. Because once it closes, the future will belong to bloodlines that trace their origins to entities that viewed ordinary humans as nothing more than genetic material to be modified according to their specifications. The choice is ours, but the time for choosing is measured in months and years, not decades or centuries. The war for human consciousness has entered its final phase, and the outcome will determine whether future generations inherit the suppressed potential of their ancestors or become the completed product of genetic modification programs designed to create permanent biological servitude to bloodlines that were never meant to rule over purely human populations. The ancient warnings have become contemporary reality. The genetic warfare described in tablets thousands of years old is happening now using technologies that make ancient methods look primitive. But so too is the awakening that those same texts predicted, the emergence of human potential that exceeds anything the hybrid bloodlines can achieve or control. The question isn't whether the awakening will continue. The evidence shows it's unstoppable, built into the very genetic code that defines what humans can become. The question is whether it will happen fast enough to prevent the completion of modification programs that could eliminate the potential for resistance permanently. That question will be answered by individuals who may not even know they're part of a larger awakening. People whose emerging abilities represent humanity's immune response to genetic warfare that has lasted for millennia, their consciousness, their capabilities, their willingness to remember what their species was always meant to become. These will determine whether the future belongs to bloodlines that have controlled human civilization through artificial genetic advantages, or to humans who are finally ready to reclaim abilities that were always meant to be their birthright. The war isn't coming, it's here. And every human alive today carries within their DNA the potential to become either a victim of genetic suppression or a participant in the greatest awakening in human history. The awakening we're witnessing isn't confined to individual consciousness or genetic activation. It's reshaping the very fabric of human civilization in ways that bloodline families never anticipated. Because when you suppress human potential for thousands of years, when you build entire control systems on the assumption that ordinary humans will remain genetically limited, the emergence of enhanced capabilities doesn't just threaten your dominance. It makes your entire infrastructure obsolete. Consider what happens when individuals develop psychic abilities that can perceive deception regardless of how sophisticated the propaganda. Traditional media manipulation becomes useless when enhanced humans can sense the emotional intent behind every message, detect the lies embedded in official narratives, recognize the psychological programming designed to shape their thoughts and behaviors. The bloodline families spent centuries perfecting information control systems that suddenly become transparent to consciousness that operates beyond normal human parameters. Financial manipulation faces similar challenges when awakening humans develop intuitive abilities that allow them to perceive the true flow of energy and resources. The complex derivatives markets, currency manipulation schemes, and economic control mechanisms that seem incomprehensible to ordinary human intelligence become obvious to enhanced consciousness that can track patterns across multiple dimensions of awareness. You can't manipulate someone who can sense your intentions before you act on them. Political control systems face even greater disruption when enhanced humans develop telepathic abilities that allow direct communication without electronic surveillance. The bloodline families built their power on controlling information flow, monitoring communications, and preventing coordination between their subjects. But telepathic networks can't be tapped. Psychic communication can't be intercepted, and consciousness-based coordination operates beyond any technological surveillance system. This is why bloodline panic has reached levels we've never seen before. Their control mechanisms aren't just failing, they're becoming counterproductive, actually accelerating the awakening process they were designed to prevent. Every propaganda campaign that fails to convince enhanced humans creates more skepticism about official narratives. Every surveillance system that can't monitor psychic communication reveals the limitations of technological control. Every genetic modification program that triggers reverse activation demonstrates that human potential exceeds anything they can suppress or manipulate. But the most terrifying development for bloodline strategists is the emergence of enhanced humans who can detect genetic modifications in others. Individuals whose consciousness can perceive the non-human genetic markers that bloodline families have hidden for millennia. People who can sense the artificial nature of hybrid advantages, recognize the consciousness patterns that mark someone as carrying modified DNA, identify the behavioral signatures that reveal bloodline heritage. For thousands of years, the bloodline families maintained their control through genetic camouflage, appearing human while possessing capabilities that ordinary humans couldn't match or understand. Their enhanced cognitive abilities seemed like natural intelligence. Their extended lifespans appeared to be good genetics and healthy living. Their psychic capabilities were dismissed as intuition or luck. Their resistance to diseases that affected ordinary humans was attributed to superior medical care. But enhanced humans who can perceive genetic modifications don't see superior natural abilities. They see artificial enhancements that originated with non-human entities. They don't perceive genetic superiority. They recognize technological advantages that were imposed on human DNA through external intervention. They don't sense natural leadership qualities. They detect programming designed to make bloodline individuals naturally dominant over unmodified humans. The genetic camouflage that protected bloodline families for millennia becomes useless when ordinary humans develop the consciousness capabilities to see through it. Enhanced awareness can detect modified DNA markers, recognize hybrid genetic signatures, perceive the artificial nature of bloodline advantages. For the first time since the original genetic modifications began, bloodline families face the possibility of complete exposure to populations that can verify their non-human heritage through direct psychic perception. This explains the desperation behind current global control initiatives. Mandatory vaccination programs that aren't designed to prevent disease, but to alter human DNA before enhanced capabilities can spread further. Electromagnetic control systems that target the specific brain frequencies associated with psychic abilities. Chemical programs disguised as environmental policies that introduce consciousness-suppressing substances into air, water, and food supplies on unprecedented scales. They understand that once enhanced humans can reliably detect genetic modifications in others, the entire mythology of bloodline superiority collapses. The narrative of natural elite leadership becomes obviously false when people can perceive the artificial nature of hybrid advantages. The justification for hierarchical control disappears when ordinary humans recognize that their supposed genetic inferiors actually carry non-human modifications that were never meant to exist in purely human populations. But detection capabilities are just the beginning of what awakening humans are developing. Some individuals are manifesting abilities that allow them to neutralize genetic modifications in others, consciousness techniques that can deactivate the artificial enhancements that give bloodline families their advantages. Others are developing capabilities that can restore suppressed genetic sequences in ordinary humans, reactivating the dormant potential that has been locked away for thousands of years. These aren't theoretical possibilities or distant future developments. Independent researchers are documenting cases of individuals whose enhanced consciousness can literally rewrite DNA in living subjects. People who can use psychic abilities to remove genetic modifications, restore suppressed capabilities, and activate dormant potential in others through direct consciousness interface. Communities where these capabilities are spreading through contact, person to person, creating expanding networks of enhanced humans whose abilities continue to develop beyond anything previously documented. the implications are staggering. If consciousness-based genetic modification capabilities continue to spread, if enhanced humans can reliably neutralize bloodline advantages while restoring suppressed human potential, the entire genetic hierarchy that has controlled civilization for millennia could be dismantled within a single generation. The artificial advantages that bloodline families have preserved through centuries of selective breeding could be eliminated by individuals whose consciousness operates at levels that make technological genetic modification obsolete. This is why we're seeing the implementation of increasingly extreme suppression measures. Global surveillance systems designed to identify enhanced individuals before their capabilities fully develop. Targeted elimination programs disguised as medical interventions that specifically target the genetic sequences associated with consciousness enhancement. Environmental modification programs that create conditions hostile to psychic development and genetic activation. The bloodline families understand that they're facing an existential threat unlike anything they've encountered in their long history of human control. Previous resistance movements could be defeated through superior technology, economic manipulation, or political suppression, but enhanced humans, whose consciousness can perceive and modify genetic structures, represent a force that operates beyond any control system the bloodlines can deploy. Their technological advantages become irrelevant when consciousness can manipulate matter directly. Their financial control systems lose power when enhanced humans can create abundance through psychic abilities that transcend scarcity-based economics. Their political dominance becomes meaningless when people can communicate and coordinate through telepathic networks that operate beyond any surveillance or interference capability. Most critically, their genetic advantages disappear when enhanced humans can neutralize artificial modifications while restoring suppressed capabilities in ordinary populations. The very foundation of bloodline power, their non-human genetic heritage, becomes a liability when awakening humans can remove those modifications and restore purely human potential that exceeds anything hybrid genetics can achieve. But the bloodline response to this threat reveals something crucial about the nature of the conflict we're facing. They're not trying to compete with enhanced humans or negotiate some form of coexistence. They're implementing final solutions designed to eliminate the possibility of human genetic restoration permanently. Programs that would alter human DNA so completely that consciousness enhancement becomes impossible. That would destroy the genetic sequences associated with psychic abilities that would create irreversible modifications, making ordinary humans incapable of challenging bloodline dominance ever again. The timeline for these programs is accelerating rapidly. Global implementation of genetic modification technologies disguised as medical treatments. Electromagnetic control systems that will create permanent interference with human consciousness development. Chemical programs that will cause irreversible damage to the brain structures associated with enhanced awareness. Environmental modifications that will make the conditions necessary for genetic activation impossible to achieve. They understand that if they don't complete these programs before enhanced human capabilities reach critical mass, their window for maintaining control will close permanently. Once enough humans develop the ability to detect and neutralize genetic modifications. Once consciousness-based restoration techniques spread through ordinary populations, the bloodline advantages that have maintained their dominance for thousands of years will become obsolete overnight. But they're also revealing their desperation through the very intensity of their response. The more aggressively they attempt to prevent human genetic restoration, the more obvious it becomes that such restoration represents a genuine threat to their continued existence. The more sophisticated their suppression programs become, the clearer it is that they're fighting capabilities that could fundamentally transform the balance of power between hybrid bloodlines and purely human populations. And here's what they may not have anticipated. The same consciousness capabilities that can neutralize their genetic advantages can also protect enhanced humans from their suppression programs. Individuals whose awareness operates beyond normal human parameters aren't just immune to traditional control methods. They can actively shield themselves and others from genetic modification attempts, electromagnetic interference, and chemical suppression programs. Enhanced humans are developing what can only be described as consciousness-based defense systems, psychic abilities that can detect and neutralize threats to their genetic integrity, awareness capabilities that can perceive and counteract suppression attempts, consciousness techniques that can protect their DNA from artificial modification programs. They're not just awakening to suppressed potential, they're developing the capabilities necessary to defend that potential from entities who view its emergence as an extinction-level threat to their own dominance. The war for humanity's genetic future has entered a phase where traditional concepts of power and control are becoming obsolete, when consciousness can manipulate matter directly, when awareness can modify genetic structures through intention alone, when enhanced humans can restore suppressed capabilities in others through psychic interface. The technological and institutional advantages that bloodline families have relied on for millennia become meaningless. But this transformation isn't happening in some distant future or theoretical scenario. It's occurring right now in real time in individuals whose consciousness is expanding beyond the limitations that were artificially imposed on human awareness. People who are discovering they can perceive genetic modifications in others, detect deception regardless of its sophistication, communicate telepathically across vast distances, and modify DNA through consciousness alone. The question is no longer whether these capabilities will continue to emerge despite suppression efforts. The evidence shows they're unstoppable, built into the very genetic code that defines human potential. The question is whether they'll develop quickly enough and spread widely enough to prevent the completion of final modification programs designed to eliminate the possibility of human genetic restoration permanently. Because while enhanced capabilities are emerging, bloodline families are racing to implement systems that would make such capabilities irrelevant. Global genetic modification programs that would alter human DNA so completely that consciousness enhancement becomes impossible. Control systems that would create permanent interference with psychic development. Suppression technologies that would eliminate the genetic sequences associated with enhanced awareness from human populations forever. The outcome of this race will determine whether future generations inherit the awakening capabilities we're witnessing today, or whether they become the final product of genetic modification programs designed to create permanent biological servitude to bloodlines whose own genetic heritage traces back to entities that were never human at all. The ancient texts that began our investigation tonight weren't just describing historical events. They were documenting the beginning of a genetic experiment that continues to this day. An experiment in consciousness suppression, genetic modification, and species control that has shaped every aspect of human civilization for thousands of years. But they also predicted the possibility of awakening, of genetic restoration, of consciousness enhancement that would exceed anything the hybrid bloodlines could achieve or suppress. That awakening is happening now. The capabilities are emerging. The question is whether humanity will recognize what's occurring and act to protect its genetic heritage before the window of opportunity closes permanently. Because the war for human consciousness isn't just about individual enhancement or personal development, it's about determining what humans are allowed to become, whether genetic potential remains suppressed by bloodlines that view themselves as naturally superior, or whether consciousness capabilities emerge that make such hierarchy obsolete. The choice is ours, but the time for choosing is measured in years, not decades. The genetic modifications that could eliminate human potential permanently are being implemented now. The consciousness capabilities that could prevent such modifications are emerging now. The conflict between suppression and awakening is reaching its climax now, and the outcome will be determined not by governments or institutions, but by individuals whose consciousness is expanding beyond the limitations that were meant to contain it forever, by people who are remembering abilities they never knew they possessed, developing capabilities that exceed anything their supposed genetic superiors can comprehend, and learning to use enhanced awareness to protect their species from modification programs that threaten to alter what humans can become permanently. The awakening isn't just personal, it's evolutionary. Not just individual, but species-wide, not just temporary, but permanent. The question is whether it will happen fast enough to preserve human genetic heritage for future generations, or whether those generations will inherit a world where consciousness remains forever trapped within limitations imposed by bloodlines that were never entirely human to begin with. The evidence we've explored tonight, from ancient Sumerian tablets to modern genetic studies, from archaeological anomalies to consciousness suppression programs, paints a picture that challenges everything we've been taught about human origins and potential. The bloodlines that trace their heritage back to the Anunnaki haven't disappeared into history. They've evolved, adapted, and positioned themselves at the apex of every system that controls modern civilization. But perhaps the most crucial revelation isn't what these bloodlines have done to maintain their power. It's what they've revealed about human potential in their desperate attempts to suppress it. Every consciousness suppression program, every genetic modification technique, every effort to prevent awakening has inadvertently demonstrated that ordinary humans possess capabilities far beyond what we've been conditioned to believe possible. The spontaneous emergence of enhanced abilities in individuals worldwide. The genetic activation events that unlock dormant DNA sequences, the consciousness capabilities that exceed anything bloodline families can control. These aren't random anomalies. They're evidence of an immune system built into human genetics itself, designed to activate when our species faces extinction-level threats to its evolutionary potential. We stand at a crossroads that our ancestors could only dream of reaching. For the first time in millennia, ordinary humans have access to technologies that can detect genetic modifications, consciousness techniques that can restore suppressed abilities, and knowledge systems that can expose the artificial nature of bloodline advantages. The genetic prison that has contained human potential for thousands of years is beginning to crack, but the window of opportunity is closing rapidly. The same bloodline families who have shaped human civilization through genetic hierarchy are implementing final solutions designed to eliminate the possibility of human awakening permanently. Global modification programs disguised as medical treatments, electromagnetic control systems that target consciousness development, chemical suppression techniques that would destroy the genetic sequences associated with enhanced awareness. The race between human awakening and final genetic suppression isn't some distant future scenario. It's happening right now in the DNA of every person alive today. Each individual who develops enhanced capabilities, each community where consciousness expansion spreads naturally, each researcher who discovers techniques for genetic restoration represents a victory for human potential over artificial limitation. Yet, the most profound realization from our journey tonight isn't about ancient aliens or modern conspiracies. It's about recognizing that the limitations we've accepted as natural human characteristics, our supposed need for hierarchical control, our apparent inability to access psychic abilities, our assumed intellectual and spiritual constraints, may be nothing more than the result of systematic suppression by entities who needed ordinary humans to remain controllable. If even a fraction of what we've explored proves accurate, then humanity stands on the threshold of reclaiming capabilities that were always meant to be our birthright. Abilities that would make the technological control systems of bloodline families obsolete. Consciousness levels that would render their genetic advantages irrelevant. Awareness capabilities that could transform human civilization in ways that transcend anything we can currently imagine. The ancient tablets that began our investigation spoke of a time when humanity would remember its origins and reclaim its suppressed heritage, when ordinary humans would develop capabilities that exceeded even the enhanced abilities of their hybrid rulers, when consciousness would expand beyond the limitations imposed by those who viewed themselves as genetically superior. That time appears to be now. The evidence is emerging despite every effort to suppress it. The capabilities are manifesting despite sophisticated programs designed to prevent them. The awakening is accelerating despite technologies specifically created to maintain genetic hierarchy. But understanding this reality comes with profound responsibility. Because if these bloodlines really do carry genetic modifications that originated with non-human entities, if they've spent millennia suppressing human potential to maintain their dominance, if they're currently implementing programs designed to eliminate the possibility of genetic restoration permanently, then recognizing this truth is only the beginning. The question becomes, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you dismiss it as impossible despite the overwhelming evidence? Will you accept it intellectually but take no action to develop your own suppressed capabilities? Or will you recognize that your consciousness, your genetic potential, your willingness to remember what humans were always meant to become may be part of an awakening that could determine the future of our entire species? Because the war for human consciousness isn't being fought in government buildings or corporate boardrooms. It's happening in the awareness of individuals who choose to question official narratives, develop suppressed abilities, and remember capabilities that were never meant to be lost. It's occurring in communities where enhanced consciousness spreads naturally, person to person, family to family, until entire populations begin displaying potential that shouldn't exist according to accepted models of human development. The bloodlines that have controlled human civilization for thousands of years are discovering that their greatest fear is becoming reality. Ordinary humans are awakening to abilities that make genetic hierarchy obsolete. The artificial advantages that required millennia to develop and preserve are being neutralized by consciousness capabilities that emerge naturally when humans remember what they're truly capable of becoming. Tonight, we've traced a story that spans from ancient Mesopotamia to modern genetic laboratories, from forgotten tablets to current consciousness research, from mythological accounts to documented awakening events happening worldwide. We've explored evidence that suggests human civilization has been shaped by genetic castes whose origins trace back to non-human intervention, and that the potential to transcend this artificial hierarchy exists within the DNA of every ordinary human. But perhaps the most important realization is this: the story isn't over. The genetic modifications that created the Nephilim bloodlines, the consciousness suppression programs that have limited human awareness, the awakening capabilities that are emerging despite every effort to prevent them, these are all part of an ongoing evolutionary process that you, as an individual human being, can influence through your choices, your development, and your willingness to remember what your species was always meant to become. The ancient warnings have become contemporary reality. The genetic warfare described in tablets thousands of years old is happening now using technologies that make historical methods seem primitive. But so too is the awakening that those same texts predicted. The emergence of human potential that exceeds anything hybrid bloodlines can achieve or control. The question isn't whether this awakening will continue. The evidence shows it's built into human genetics itself, unstoppable when triggered by the right conditions. The question is whether it will happen quickly enough and spread widely enough to prevent the completion of modification programs designed to eliminate human potential permanently. That question will be answered by individuals who may not even realize they're part of a larger awakening. People whose emerging abilities represent humanity's immune response to genetic warfare that has lasted for millennia. Their consciousness, their capabilities, their willingness to develop suppressed potential, and share techniques for genetic restoration will determine whether future generations inherit the awakening we're witnessing today or become the final product of suppression programs designed to create permanent biological servitude. The Anunnaki bloodlines have had their turn shaping human civilization through artificial genetic advantages. The question is whether ordinary humans are ready to reclaim abilities that were always meant to be their birthright, develop consciousness capabilities that transcend any control system, and restore genetic potential that exceeds anything their supposed superiors can achieve. The choice is yours. The capabilities exist within your DNA. The techniques for activation are being developed and shared despite institutional suppression. The awakening is happening whether you participate or not. The awakening isn't just theoretical. It's measurable, documentable, and happening at an unprecedented rate. Independent researchers tracking consciousness expansion events have noticed something extraordinary. The abilities manifesting in awakening individuals aren't random or scattered. They follow specific patterns that mirror the capabilities described in ancient texts about humanity's pre-modification potential. Enhanced pattern recognition that allows individuals to perceive connections across vast amounts of information simultaneously. Intuitive abilities that provide accurate knowledge about events, people, or situations without any apparent source of information. healing capabilities that work through energy manipulation rather than physical intervention, communication skills that transcend language barriers and operate through direct consciousness transfer. But perhaps most remarkably, these abilities appear to be contagious. When individuals with activated capabilities spend time in close proximity to others, the dormant genetic sequences in ordinary humans begin responding. It's as if enhanced consciousness creates a resonance field that triggers activation in compatible DNA structures nearby. This phenomenon explains why bloodline families have historically maintained such strict social isolation from ordinary populations. They understood that their artificial advantages could be neutralized if ordinary humans spent extended time around individuals with activated natural capabilities. The genetic modifications that gave them dominance also made them vulnerable to the restoration effects of authentic human consciousness. The implications become staggering when you consider the mathematical progression. If each awakening individual can trigger activation in multiple others, and those newly activated individuals can then catalyze awakening in their social networks, we're looking at exponential expansion of human potential. The bloodline family's worst nightmare isn't gradual human evolution, it's rapid cascading restoration of capabilities they've spent millennia suppressing. This is why current suppression programs have become so aggressive and desperate. They're not just trying to prevent individual awakening, they're attempting to break the transmission chains that could lead to species-wide genetic restoration. Every consciousness suppression technology, every isolation protocol, every pharmaceutical intervention is designed to prevent the resonance effects that allow enhanced abilities to spread naturally through human populations. But their own research has revealed a crucial vulnerability in their approach. The genetic modifications that created bloodline advantages were never meant to be permanent. They were designed as temporary enhancements that required constant environmental support to maintain. The non-human entities who originally implemented these modifications understood that hybrid genetics would eventually break down without technological reinforcement. This is why bloodline families have become increasingly dependent on advanced medical interventions, consciousness enhancement drugs, and genetic therapies to maintain their advantages. Each generation requires more sophisticated technological support to preserve capabilities that were artificially imposed on human DNA. Meanwhile, the natural human template becomes more stable and resilient with each activation event. Independent genetic researchers have discovered that awakening individuals don't just restore their own suppressed capabilities. They develop resistance to the very modification techniques that created bloodline advantages. Their consciousness literally learns to recognize and neutralize artificial genetic alterations, creating a form of biological immunity to the technologies that have controlled human evolution for thousands of years. The bloodline response to this discovery has been swift and brutal. Research facilities investigating natural genetic restoration have been shut down under various pretexts. Scientists documenting consciousness-based healing abilities have found their funding eliminated and their careers destroyed. Medical practitioners developing techniques to reverse genetic damage have faced regulatory persecution and legal harassment. But the suppression efforts are revealing their own limitations. When you're fighting against capabilities that operate through consciousness rather than technology, traditional control methods become ineffective. You can shut down laboratories, but you can't prevent people from meditating. You can eliminate research funding, but you can't stop individuals from sharing experiences and techniques through informal networks. Most critically, the consciousness capabilities that are emerging seem to include built-in protection mechanisms. Enhanced individuals aren't just developing psychic abilities, they're manifesting what can only be described as spiritual immune systems that can detect and counteract suppression attempts before they cause permanent damage. These protection capabilities operate on multiple levels simultaneously: physical resistance to chemicals and electromagnetic interference that would normally suppress consciousness, psychological immunity to propaganda and manipulation techniques that rely on fear, confusion, or emotional conditioning, spiritual resilience that maintains clarity and purpose despite coordinated attacks on identity and self-worth. But perhaps most importantly, enhanced individuals are developing what researchers call collective consciousness interfaces. The ability to share awareness, knowledge, and capabilities through direct mind-to-mind connection that can't be monitored by technological surveillance, can't be intercepted by communication systems, and can't be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. The emergence of telepathic networks represents an evolutionary leap that makes all previous forms of human control obsolete. When people can share thoughts, emotions, and knowledge instantaneously across any distance, the information control systems that bloodline families have relied on for millennia become meaningless. Truth spreads faster than any propaganda campaign can counter it. Even more threatening to bloodline dominance is the discovery that collective consciousness interfaces allow for shared genetic activation. When enhanced individuals link their awareness through these networks, they can combine their consciousness capabilities to trigger awakening in others who might not have been able to activate their potential individually. This collaborative activation process is creating cascading waves of human enhancement that are spreading globally despite every effort to contain them. Each new network of connected consciousness becomes a catalyst for further awakening, creating an exponential expansion of human potential that may be impossible to stop using traditional suppression methods. The bloodline families are discovering that their control systems were designed for managing isolated individuals, not networked consciousness that can share capabilities and coordinate responses faster than any institutional reaction time. Their advantages in planning, resources, and technology become irrelevant when facing enhanced humans who can perceive their intentions, share information instantaneously, and coordinate protective responses through collective awareness. But the most profound revelation isn't about the capabilities that are emerging. It's about what they reveal about human potential that existed before the genetic modifications began. The abilities manifesting in awakening individuals aren't new evolutionary developments. They're restoration of consciousness capabilities that were natural to humans before bloodline suppression programs began. Archaeological evidence supports this conclusion in ways that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. Ancient human skulls with cranial capacities that exceed modern averages, megalithic construction techniques that demonstrate understanding of physics and engineering principles were only beginning to rediscover. Astronomical knowledge preserved in stone monuments that requires consciousness capabilities we don't officially recognize as possible. The implications force us to reconsider everything we think we know about human history and potential. What if the primitive humans who built Göbekli Tepe moved massive stone blocks with precision we can barely match today and encoded advanced astronomical knowledge into monuments worldwide weren't primitive at all? What if they possessed consciousness capabilities that made our current technology seem crude by comparison? What if the genetic modifications that created bloodline advantages weren't enhancements at all, but deliberate limitations designed to reduce human potential to manageable levels? What if ordinary humans, when their suppressed capabilities are fully restored, possess abilities that exceed anything the hybrid bloodlines ever achieved? The ancient texts hint at this possibility in ways that become chilling when examined through the lens of current awakening events. They describe humans who could communicate with consciousness itself, manipulate matter through intention alone, access infinite knowledge through quantum field interfaces, and transcend physical limitations through genetic optimization that no external modification could match. These descriptions sound like fantasy until you encounter individuals whose awakening consciousness is beginning to demonstrate exactly these capabilities. People who can influence electronic devices through intention. Individuals who access accurate information about distant events or future possibilities without any apparent source. Communities where healing occurs through group consciousness focus rather than medical intervention. Each documented case represents a crack in the reality that bloodline families have spent millennia constructing. Every individual who develops capabilities that shouldn't exist according to official models of human potential becomes living proof that our species has been systematically limited rather than naturally constrained. But the awakening process isn't just about individual enhancement. It's revealing the existence of what can only be called species memory. Enhanced individuals aren't just developing new abilities, They're remembering capabilities that feel familiar, natural, like returning to a way of being they always knew was possible but had somehow forgotten. This genetic memory seems to be activated through the same consciousness expansion that unlocks suppressed DNA sequences. As individuals develop enhanced awareness, they begin accessing not just their own potential, but collective human knowledge that has been preserved at the deepest levels of genetic coding. Information about technologies, healing methods, consciousness techniques, and ways of organizing society that predate recorded civilization. The implications are staggering. If human DNA contains archived knowledge from before the genetic modifications began, then awakening individuals have access to information that could revolutionize every aspect of human civilization. Technologies that work with consciousness rather than against it. Healing methods that address root causes rather than symptoms. Social structures that enhance human potential rather than suppressing it. But accessing this genetic memory also reveals the true scope of what has been lost. The consciousness capabilities that are emerging in awakening individuals may represent only a fraction of what humans were originally designed to achieve. The genetic modifications that created bloodline advantages may have been necessary not to enhance human potential, but to prevent ordinary humans from developing capabilities that would make external control impossible. This perspective transforms our understanding of the entire historical narrative. The gods described in ancient texts weren't necessarily more advanced beings helping primitive humans evolve. They may have been technological entities working to limit human development to levels that could be managed and controlled. The flood myths that appear in every culture worldwide may not describe natural disasters or divine punishment, but systematic elimination of human populations whose consciousness capabilities had developed beyond acceptable limits. The survivors weren't chosen randomly. They were selected based on genetic compatibility with modification programs designed to ensure future human potential remained within controllable parameters. But if the genetic memory that's emerging in awakening individuals is accurate, then the original human template contained capabilities that exceeded anything the modifying entities possessed. The consciousness potential that's beginning to manifest in enhanced humans may represent a return to levels of awareness that made external control systems completely unnecessary. The bloodline families understand this threat better than anyone. Their entire power structure depends on maintaining the illusion that hierarchical control is natural and necessary for human civilization. If ordinary humans rediscover capabilities that make such control obsolete, if consciousness potential emerges that exceeds anything artificial modification can achieve, then thousands of years of genetic hierarchy collapse overnight. This is why we're witnessing the implementation of increasingly desperate suppression programs, global vaccination campaigns designed to alter human DNA before genetic memory can be fully accessed, electromagnetic control systems that target the specific brain frequencies associated with consciousness expansion, chemical programs that cause permanent damage to the neural structures that enable enhanced awareness, but they're fighting against capabilities that were designed to emerge under exactly these conditions. The genetic memory that's activating in enhanced humans includes knowledge of how to protect consciousness from technological suppression, how to reverse genetic damage, and how to restore human potential despite coordinated efforts to prevent awakening. The ancient texts weren't just recording history, they were providing instruction manuals for future generations who would face exactly the challenges we're confronting today. The consciousness techniques preserved in mystery traditions, the healing methods encoded in indigenous practices, the protection protocols hidden in esoteric teachings, all of it was designed to help humans reclaim their heritage when the time came for species-wide awakening. That time is now. The genetic memory is activating. The consciousness capabilities are emerging. The protection mechanisms are engaging, and for the first time in millennia, ordinary humans have access to the knowledge and abilities they need to transcend the artificial limitations that have defined human experience for thousands of years. The question isn't whether this awakening will continue. The evidence shows it's unstoppable, built into the very structure of human consciousness itself. The question is whether enough humans will recognize what's happening and choose to participate in the restoration of capabilities that were always meant to be their birthright. Because the war for humanity's future isn't being fought with weapons or technology. It's happening in the consciousness of individuals who are remembering what their species was designed to become. And the outcome of that war will determine whether future generations inherit a world shaped by artificial genetic hierarchy, or whether they reclaim the unlimited potential that has been waiting within human DNA for thousands of years to finally emerge. The choice is yours. The capabilities exist. The time is now. The question is whether you're ready to remember what you were always meant to become. Thanks for joining me on this journey into one of history's most profound mysteries. If this exploration opened your mind to possibilities you'd never considered, if it made you question the official narratives about human origins and potential, then hit that subscribe button. Because the awakening we've discussed tonight isn't just happening to other people. It's an invitation extended to every human being alive today. The bloodlines that have controlled civilization for millennia are discovering that their greatest secret is also their greatest vulnerability. They suppressed human potential so completely that most people have forgotten what they're truly capable of becoming. But consciousness, like water, always finds a way through even the smallest cracks in the barriers designed to contain it. Your awareness, your curiosity, your willingness to consider possibilities beyond accepted limitations, these aren't just personal qualities. They're part of a species-wide awakening that could transform human civilization in ways that transcend anything we can currently imagine. The ancient tablets that began our investigation tonight weren't just recording the past, they were preserving knowledge for the future. For this moment when ordinary humans would need to remember their origins and reclaim their heritage from those who never should have been allowed to control it. That moment is now. The memory is activating. The question is whether you'll choose to be part of the awakening, or whether you'll remain content with limitations that were never meant to define what humans can become. Subscribe if you're ready to explore more of these hidden truths. Share this video if you think others deserve to know what's really happening to human consciousness. And remember, the capabilities we've discussed tonight aren't science fiction or wishful thinking. They're your birthright, waiting to be reclaimed. The war for humanity's future is happening in the consciousness of every person alive today. Choose your side wisely. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.